Tryon Palace gratefully acknowledges the North Carolina Humanities Council, a statewide nonprofit and affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. The council serves as an advocate for lifelong learning through dialogue about all facets of human life and the exploration and celebration of the many voices and stories of North Carolina's cultures and heritage. Additional North Carolina Humanities Council programs are Museums on Main Street, which bring Smithsonian traveling exhibits to small town museums in North Carolina. Literature and Medicine, Humanities at the Heart of Healthcare, and the Rhodes Scholar Lecture Series. The North Carolina Humanities Council also offers grassroots and standing together grant opportunities for community-based programs. The North Carolina Humanities Council's programs are free and open to the public. However, making these programs happen is not free. We invite you to become a partner. To contribute to the work of the North Carolina Humanities Council, please visit www.nchumanities.org. Tryon Palace would also like to thank our other sponsors, the Tryon Palace Commission, the American Battlefield Trust, First Flight Federal Credit Union, and the Tryon Palace Foundation for their generous support of this project. Welcome to Tryon Palace's first virtual symposium. I'm Bill McCray, Executive Director, and I thank you for joining us today. Our topic is the United States Colored Troops, with a particular emphasis on the 35th Regiment, formed here in New Bern at the New Bern Academy. I want to particularly thank the men of the 35th for their participation today. You'll get to see quite a bit of them on screen and in some videos. I also want to thank Lynn Norris and Sharon Bryant of our education staff, and Rob Jones and Zanetta Padillo, who have been production assistants today. I'm delighted that we have Charles Tendell, who is our producer of this symposium. We have had a number of financial sponsors key to bringing you this symposium, and they include the North Carolina Humanities Council, Triumph Palace Commission, the Triumph Palace Foundation, First Flight Federal Credit Union, and the American Battlefield Trust. We are grateful to those sponsors for helping us make today's symposium available. Our first session is entitled, "O Freedom, O Freedom," and I am pleased to introduce the moderator for that session, Craig Allen, who is a member of the 35th Regiment. Craig?
Thank you, Bill. Good morning. Our first speaker is Mitch Kapor. Let me tell you a little about Mitch. He's a storyteller, an author, and an entertainer who has performed at the Kennedy Center, the Smithsonian, and the inauguration for the former President, Barack Obama. And one of the characters he portrayed tells the story of a USCT. Let's welcome Mitch.
Good morning. Today I'll be giving you some Paul Laurence Dunbar, who was born in 1872, passed in 1906, some of his work on the colored soldiers. The first piece I'll give you is called When They Listed Colored Soldiers, and I actually do it in a third person singular as opposed to a first person singular. And it goes like this. They was talking in the cabin. They was talking in the hall, but she listened kinda careless, not a thinking about it all. And on Sunday too, she noticed. They was whispering mighty much, standing all along the roadside when they let her out of church. But she didn't think about it till the middle of the week, when her liars come to see her, and somehow he couldn't speak. Then she seed all in a minute what he'd come to see her for. They had listed colored soldiers, and her lies was going to war. Oh, she hugged him and she kissed him and she begged him not to go, but he told her that his conscience, it was calling to him so. And he couldn't bear to linger when he had the chance to fight for the freedom they had given him and the glory of the right. So he kissed her, and he left her when she promised to be true. And they put a knapsack on him and this coat all colored blue. So she gave him Pap's old Bible from the bottom of the drawer when they listed colored soldiers, and her liars was going to war. Then she thought about the weary miles that he would have to tramp, and she couldn't be contented when they took him to the camp. While her heart now broke with grief, and till she seed him on the street, then she thought that she could go and throw her body at his feet. For his buttons was a-shining, and his face was shining too. And he looked so strong and mighty in his coat of soldier blue that she hollered, "Step up, Manny!" Though her throat was sore and raw when they listed colored soldiers, and her lies was going to war. Oh, Miss cried when Master left her. Young Miss moaned her brother Ned, but she didn't know they feelings was the very words they said when she told them she was sorry. They had done get up they all, and they only seemed more prouder that they men's had heard the call. Both her masters went in gray suits, but she loved that Yankee blue. And she thought that she could sorrow for the losing of them too, but she couldn't. For she didn't know the half of what she saw till they listed colored soldiers, and her lies went to war. Master Jack come back all sickly. He was broke for life, they said, and they left her poor young master some as on the roadside, dead. When the women cried and mourned him, she could feel it through and through, 'cause she had a love done fighting in the way of danger, too. Then they told her they had laid him some else way down south to rest, with the flag that he had fit for shining there across his chest. Well, she cried, but then she reckoned that's what God had called him for. When they listed colored soldiers, and her liars went to war. I'm a soldier in the army of the Lord. I'm a soldier in the army of the Lord. If the muse were mine to tempt it, and my feeble voice was strong, if my tongue were trained to measures, I would sing a stirring song. I would sing a song heroic of those noble sons of Ham, of those gallant colored soldiers who fought for Uncle Sam. In the early days, you scorned them, and with many a flip and flout said, "These battles are the white man's, and the whites will fight them out." Well, up the hills you fought and faltered. In the vales you strove and bled, while your ears still heard the thunder of the foe's advancing tread. Then distress fell on the nation, and the flag was drooping low. Should the dust pollute your banner? No, the nation shouted, no. So when war in savage triumph spread abroad its funeral pall, then you called the colored soldiers, and they answered to your call. And like hounds, unleashed and eager for the lifeblood of their prey, sprung them forth and bore them bravely in the thickest of the fray. And wherever the fight was hottest, where the bullets fastest fell, there they pressed unblanched and fearless at the very mouth of hell. While they rallied to the standard to uphold it by their might, none were stronger in the labor, none braver in the fight. From the blazing breach at Wagner to the plains of Old Lustee, they were foremost in the fight of the battles of the free. And that pillow, God have mercy on the deeds committed there, and the souls of those poor victims sent to thee without a prayer. Let the fullness of thy pity or the hot-wrought spirit sway of those gallant colored soldiers who fell fighting on that day. Yes, we blacks enjoy our freedom, and we won it dearly too. For the lifeblood of our thousands did the southern fields bedew. In the darkness of our bondage, in the depths of slavery's might, our muskets flashed the dawning, and we fought our way to light. We were comrades then, and brothers. Are we more or less today? We were good to stop a bullet or to front the fearful fray. We were citizens and soldiers when rebellion raised its head, and those traits that made us worthy, those virtues are not dead. We have shared your nightly vigils. We have shared your daily toil, and our blood with yours commingling has enriched this southern soil. We have slept and marched and suffered neath the same dark skies as you. We have met as fierce a foemen and have been as brave and true. And our deeds shall find a record in the registry of fame. For our blood has cleansed completely every blot of slavery's shame. So all honor and all glory to those so-called noble sons of Ham, those gallant colored soldiers who fought for Uncle Sam. The colored soldiers. The next piece of Dunbar's is called The Unsung Heroes. And I like to preface it with the song Sojourner Truth wrote. We are colored Yankee soldiers who've enlisted for the war. We are fighting for the Union. We are fighting for the law. We can shoot a rebel further than a white man ever saw as we go marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Huh. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Huh. Glory, glory, hallelujah. As we go marching on. A song for the unsung heroes who rose in this country's need when the life of the land was threatened by the slaver's cruel greed. For the men who came from the cornfields, who came from the plow and the flail, who rallied round when they heard the sound of the mighty man of the rail. They laid them down in the valley. Huh! They laid them down in the wood. Huh! And the world looked on at the work they did and whispered, "It is good." They fought their way on the hillsides. They fought their way on the glen. And God looked down on their sinews brown and said, "I have made them men." They went to the blue lines gladly, and the blue lines took them in. And the men who saw their muskets fire thought not of their dusky skin. The gray lines rose, then melted beneath their scathing showers, and they said, "'Tis true, they have a force to do, these old slave boys of ours." Our Wagner saw their glory, and Pillow knew their blood that poured on a nation's altar a sacrificial flood. Port Hudson heard their war cry that smote the smoke-filled air, and the old free fires of their savage sires again were kindled there. They laid them down in the valleys where the greening valleys gem, and the song of the thunderous cannon was their sole requiem. And the great white wreath that belted its hue of a dusky cloud was the flag that furled over her saddened world and the sheet that made their shroud. Almighty God of the battles, who held them in their hand, who gave them strength the whole day's length to fight for their native land. They are lying dead on the hillside. They are lying dead on the glen, no plain. And they're lying dead on the plain, and we have not fire to smite the lyre and sing them one brief strain. Give thou me the power to sing them in their might, the men who braved the master's whip and did not fear the fight, that I may sing of their virtues as Anjali's and griots did of old, till the pride of face and the hate of race grows obsolete and cold. A song for the unsung heroes who fell on the bloody sod, who fought their way from night till day and struggled up to God. The Unsung Heroes by Paul Laurence Dunbar. I think that's my time.
Thank you, Mitch. Our next speaker coming up is Dr. Frank Smith. Dr. Smith is the Chief Executive Officer of the African American Civil War Museum in Washington, D.C. It is the only memorial to the colored troops that fought in the Civil War. Smith attended Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, where he was a founding member of the Students Nonviolence Coordinator Committee, the SNCC. Smith earned his PhD from Union Institute in Ohio. He serves as the District of Columbia's Board of Education and City Council. Let's welcome Dr. Frank Smith. Dr. Smith? Dr. Smith, unmute yourself.
Did that so I can get on the phone. So let me say good morning again. My name is Frank Smith, and you've been told I'm the founding director of the African American Civil War Memorial Museum here in Washington, D.C. First of all, I want to give a shout out to Tryon Palace for hosting this event. I've been there a couple of times already to visit, and particularly to Sharon Bryant, who has been courageous and supportive and visionary, and who's helped us all and I help us to try to tell the story of these 209,000 African American soldiers who joined President Lincoln in the Civil War to fight for their freedom and to keep America united under one flag. And so we pay tribute to them here in Washington, D.C. with a monument that consists of a bronze statue that's about 12 feet tall. It's surrounded by walls that have stainless steel plaques on them. And those walls have 209,145 names. 209,145 names. Those names come from really across the country. But of the 200,000 names, 3 out of 4 of them were enslaved when the war started. They were living in the states of the former Confederacy, from Virginia to Texas. And so they were the ones that were covered by the Emancipation Proclamation. 3 out of 4 of them. When the war started, they were enslaved. When the war was over, they had not only been liberated, but they had put on Union uniforms. They had marched out on these battlefields. They'd taken bullets like everybody else. And they come back home now as men who had proven themselves in battle. Many of them took up public service, ran for office in some of these states. And one of them in particular that I'd like to talk about, since we were talking about North Carolina, is a guy named John Carraway, who was actually born he was enslaved. He was born, and his father, he was the son of the plantation owner. So his father was his owner. And before the war, though, his owner had freed him and his mother. And his mother had moved, they had sold his mother downriver to Alabama, but John Carraway had gone off to New York with one of his aunts because he was free, and his mother sent him off to live with his aunt. When the Civil War started, John Carraway didn't just sit on his freedom. He didn't sit back and say, I've got mine, you got to get yours. He volunteered right away to join. He ended up in the Massachusetts 54th, fought down in the Battle of Fort Wagner and in other places. And when the war was over, went back to Alabama to get his mother, whom he had not seen in many years. He gets back to Alabama, and his mother, of course, by then, I'm 78 years old, so I can feel her. She just basically said, look, I'm tired of moving. I ain't moving no more. If you want to go back to New York, you go back and have a good time, but I'm staying here in Alabama. This is my home. And like a good son, he sat down roots there with his mother. Eventually gets elected to the South Carolina State Legislature, to the Alabama State Legislature. And as John C. Carraway, as a Civil War veteran who had earned his stripes on the battlefield and ended up in public office in the state of Alabama, is John C. Carraway, who introduces a bill that creates the public school system for the state of Alabama. That system that educates thousands of people today, black and white. But it was John C. Carraway who had passed through the crucible of the Civil War, went out and got himself elected to office. And so I wanted to share that story with you because these stories not only are stories of people who passed through the crucible of war, earned their stripes on the battlefield, but they also went home and made marks as citizens of the of them a newfound life, where they earn their freedom under the 13th Amendment, their citizenship under the 14th Amendment, and of course the right to vote, which we're still struggling with now in some of these places. And that fight over whether everybody can vote or not is still going on here in America, and probably will go on the rest of our lives. And you probably heard from my introduction, I had a little bit to do with that as a civil rights worker in Mississippi from 1962 to 1968, working on voter registration there. But I want to focus a little bit more on the African American Civil War Memorial here in D.C. Tell you a couple other stories, and one of these stories that we're working on right now is we expand our museum into a larger building. Under COVID, we're under COVID and under construction. So many, we're doing what many museums are doing now, sort of reinventing ourselves so we can live in a new environment where the number of people who can visit is restricted, and where we have to practice safety, keep our distance, wear masks and things like that, so that we don't contaminate ourselves and don't contaminate the public. So we're working under those conditions like everybody else, but we're also in the middle of expansion. We're tripling the size of our building, our exhibit, something that started in 2014. So we're at the tail end of it now. We expect to be finished in early spring. But in this new environment with a larger exhibit space, we're doing two things. One, we are doing a special exhibit on First Lady Michelle Obama, who is a descendant of a African-American Civil War soldier on her mother and her father's side. We're using a book by a woman named Rachel Swarns, whose name you may know, called American Tapestry. She follows the Michelle Obama family in that book, her origins in Georgetown, South Carolina on her father's side, and on her mother's side, Jerry Sutton Suter was in Alabama. He ended up going to Corinth, Mississippi, and eventually joined the Union Army himself. When the war is over, he's a sergeant, and he eventually moves to Kentucky and then Southern Illinois, where he meets Michelle Obama's family. They get married, and eventually they all migrate to Chicago, which is where we pick her up in Chicago. But Caesar Cohen, on her father's side, was born in Georgetown, South Carolina, as I said before. And Caesar Cohen he was living on a plantation there and when the 128th USCT passed through there, and he, like many of these soldiers, he figured, here goes some black men with a rifle on their shoulders and bullets in their pockets and US on their lapel. I want some of this. So he tagged on with the army and eventually ends up in the Union Army. He comes back home. Caesar Cohen comes back to his hometown after the war is over with. He gets married, has a daughter named Rosella. Rosella marries a man named Jim Robinson I, then Jim Robinson I, a son named Jim Robinson II. And then Michelle Obama's father, by the time she's born, they're living in Chicago. And so we picked that story up in Chicago. And by the way, most people probably didn't even know this. She gets her interest in politics, or her dislike for politics, as she says now, Michelle Obama does, from the fact that her father was a precinct captain in the old Daily machine in Chicago. Now, having been elected to the city council myself and having had a few precinct captains that worked for me, I can tell you right now, we have never had a machine here like Daily had in Chicago. Basically, what people said in Chicago was, if you didn't vote for Mayor Daley, you couldn't get your trash picked up. And so, he had a system of spoils and rewards that went right there. But the person who implemented that system was his precinct captain. His precinct captain had the names of 300 or 400 registered voters. It was his job to keep up with those voters, take care of their needs. And one of them that was somebody died, he'd get some kind of a resolution from the council, from the mayor, for that person. And so Michelle Obama was introduced to this by her father, who had those lists in his house. She walked to the polling places with him and said her first memory of voting was going to, now this was long before she ever met the young man named Barack Obama. Her name was Michelle Robinson then. She had not yet been engaged in marriage to become the president of the United States. So it's a story that we think will help lift the story of these African-American soldiers, will show how they not only survived this war, but they also came home and did some things that are good and wonderful. And what we hope is this will inspire other people to do their own family tree, to do their own research to see who they might be descended from here as a part of our efforts. And then finally, I wanted to just say one other thing before my time runs out, and that is this. In this expansion that we're doing of our museum into this new space, we are installing in front of our new building what is called a ceremonial porch with ceremonial steps leading up to the porch. And right in the center of that porch on a landing there is going to be a statue of President Abraham Lincoln. In the act of signing the Emancipation Proclamation, we have frozen Lincoln with pen in hand, with proclamation in hand, at the moment he signs this Emancipation Proclamation, which takes place January 1, 1863. And it's through paragraph 8 of that proclamation that these 200,000 Black soldiers march into the Civil War, through paragraph 8. Without that proclamation, there is no Black Army. Without that proclamation, there's no 13th Amendment. Without that proclamation, there's no 14th Amendment, no 15th Amendment. So we have now captured that moment, and we have Lincoln sitting on one side of Vermont Avenue, facing the monument across the street where these 200,000 names were located. We think this is going to create a very dynamic environment, which will further expand the story. And we're doing the whole thing on Lincoln, and we're recasting the story of Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. And some of you may have seen on August 9th, I had an op-ed piece in the Washington Post here in Washington, D.C., where I talked about the Lincoln statue in the context of these demonstrations that are going on now, where they're trying to take down some of these statues to Confederates who really were disloyal to the Union, committed treason, and never should have been, statues never should have been put up there in the first place. But I knew that one day that enough Americans, enough white Americans, enough well-meaning Americans would rise up and decide that those monuments did not represent their point of view about America. They did not represent the hatred that these monuments stood for. They did not represent the slavery that these monuments stood for. And they would rise up and start taking them down. So my hat's off to people who are doing that right now around the country. But as they look, they have to think that to themselves, what are you going to put up in this place? And so what we said is that we think that they should take a look at this concept that we put together of Lincoln on one side and this African American Civil War memorial on the other side, where you have African American soldiers who have the rifles on their shoulders, as Douglas says, and bullets in their pockets, and U.S. on their lapel, facing Lincoln, who is signing, in the act of signing the Emancipation Proclamation, which is the document that activates them and gets them into the military. And so we're actually offering those up to people around the country, and we've actually had one place in Ohio, of all places, where they're wanting to establish two places now. One in Ohio, and city council member in New York was going to build a place for one of these statues there in New York, and I've had some indirect conversations with the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, because I was in Mississippi in the civil rights movement, and my hope one day before I leave this earth to get something there to represent the story of Mississippi. There were 17,000 African Americans from Mississippi who joined the Union Army and fought for freedom in the Civil War. 17,000 names on this wall of honor for the African American Civil War Memorial in Washington, D.C. And you're going to hear later from the former mayor of Vicksburg, Mississippi, who himself almost single-handedly raised the money, raised public awareness, after necessary approvals, to put a monument up in the Vicksburg battlefield there for soldiers who are buried at Vicksburg National Battlefield, some of whom were engaged in the battle there at the New Market around Vicksburg. And so I want to hear from him talk about his efforts in putting that together. I was there for the dedication, and I'm happy to be his friend and know what he's doing. But let me just say finally that the people, that there is a group that's forming around Ohio that talked to me about this concept of what he calls forming America during the time of this political turmoil that's related to Black Lives Matter and this strident political election that seems to be dividing the country. His concept that we ought to try to find things that we can work together on to calm America, which is an interesting concept for me. It's a new concept, but it fits with my sort of my religious belief. It also, I think, fits with our responsibility as citizens and as patriotic Americans to try to step in where we can and offer up ideas and things that make a difference. And so they talked about this Lincoln statute as a way to look at the way the community of Americans. What I've said to them over and over again, I'm going to repeat in case send them a link so they can listen to the program anymore. So I'm going to repeat what I said to them already, and that is that you need these two monuments together to get the dynamic that I'm talking about. You need Lincoln on one side, citing the Emancipation Proclamation. On the other side, you need the African American Civil War Memorial, which has the story of has the images of three soldiers with their rifles in hand, a sailor, and then on the converse side of it, there's a soldier with his family, his mother, his father, his wife, his kid, all of whom would have been enslaved when the war started, and all of whom were liberated by this army that was put together and called into service by the Emancipation Proclamation. So we have a chance to do something I think that is meaningful here in the time that we have left on this earth, and despite the pandemic and all the other things that we have to put up with and negotiate around and figure out how to tolerate and live with and survive with too. By the way, we have other work to do, and so I'm happy to be able to join you this morning in this discussion. I look forward to other persons who are going to come onto the program today. Many of whom are friends, and I want to say to them that we're happy to be in the service, and we're happy to be able to add our little support to the efforts there at Fire Palace, and particularly to our friend Sharon Bryant. May God continue to bless all of you, and may God continue to bless America. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Smith. Our next speaker is Dr. Greg Mixon. He's a history professor at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. He holds a BA from Washington University in St. Louis, an MA from the University of Cincinnati, and a PhD from the University of Cincinnati. His area of interest is the black militias in the South. He's the author of Show Thyself a Man, Georgia State Troopers, Colors, 1865 to 1905, and the Atlanta Riot, Race, Class, and Violence in a New South City. Let's welcome Dr. Greg Mixon.
Thank you. I'm presenting a paper today. So on March 31st, 1866, Sergeant H.D. Dudley, Company K, 35th United States Colored Troops, posted an editorial in the Black-owned South Carolina Leader. He reminded blacks and whites about the promises of the Civil War as Reconstruction began. Stationed in Walterboro, South Carolina, with the 35th as occupation troops, months before the unit would be mustered out, Dudley lamented the failure of local whites to recognize the commitments to equality that define the valor of black Civil War soldiers. Further, Dudley's editorial noted that equality was part of the federal government's commitment to African Americans, in part because he associated equality with the Emancipation Proclamation. Sergeant Dudley endeavored to use his editorial to define equality specifically and black freedom generally. He was glad to see that the Leader was an independent journal that set itself upon the firm basis of equal rights. He also argued that the Emancipation Proclamation clearly embraced equality because there should be no distinction in regard to color. Equality in Dudley's mind was a fundamental principle in the Emancipation Proclamation of President Abraham Lincoln. That document not only had announced that the races in the United States were collectively equal, Lincoln had also declared to the people of the nation that slavery should be forever abolished, no more to exist within the limits of the United States. Dudley also expressed in 1866 what blacks in North Carolina and South Carolina sought to make a reality in both states, when local elite whites from 1865 to 1868 retook control of state government. Union occupation of both states empowered blacks after 1868 to participate in the governance of the Carolinas. The institution-building blacks performed as voting and governing citizens included the creation of state militia units as African Americans attempted to exercise black political power. The militia was an integral part of governance in these states. Yet Black North Carolinians did not have the kind of political clout in the state where the militia and political power resulted in African Americans having a hand in governance. South Carolina, in contrast, demographically had a significant advantage voter-wise. That advantage became clear with joint Black and white governance that elevated Black Republican Robert Brown Elliott to the position of Assistant Adjutant General of the South Carolina National Guard. Elliott, unlike his North Carolina counterparts, made policy for the South Carolina National Guard as the third ranking officer of the unit. Blacks in the Carolinas experienced the presence and absence of power as militiamen in North Carolina and South Carolina. By 1868, in both North Carolina and South Carolina, Blacks and whites met in convention to create new state constitutions that were more open to Black and white unified governance under Republican Party sponsorship. Under these biracially conceived constitutions, reinforced by Union Army occupation, North and South Carolina state governments established segregated biracial state militia companies. In North Carolina, Governor William W. Holden took the position that whites must rule because of their superior intelligence. Writing Major General John Schofield in June 1865, Holden asked that the 35th will continue in the United States service as garrison troops, presumably in South Carolina. In 1868, Holden founded North Carolina's Republican Party with the intent of creating a state open to all citizens. He also noted during his July 4th, 1868 inaugural address as elected governor that the new state constitution called for the immediate organization of the militia to ensure that the laws were faithfully executed statewide. In Holden's mind, the militia, a 6,000-man unit, had the primary mission of protecting state government, from white domestic enemies threatening both North Carolina's and the United States governments. Holden's administration, 1868 to 1870, would be focused on fighting white supremacy, the Ku Klux Klan, and a wide variety of anti-black white political violence determined to restore antebellum white governance. Holden and the Republican Party envisioned state government as the protector of the Black vote and guarantor of political and legal equality to Blacks. In 1870, during what conservative whites called the Kirk-Holden War, Black North Carolina militiamen from New Bern were mobilized from July to September to protect the state capitol in Raleigh with their fellow white militiamen. North Carolina Company H, an all-Black militia unit in the racially segregated but biracial 1st North Carolina State Troops, was led by George B. Willis of New Bern. Historian Samuel B. McGuire has noted militia service provided one of many ways ordinary African Americans engaged in and shaped Reconstruction-era politics in North Carolina. Company H, in Raleigh, McGuire reported, functioned as a bulwark of law and order. Company H's home base, the city of New Bern and Craven County, had been since 1865 the banner county of Republican radicalism. Local Blacks who were members of Company H, Captain Willis was Justice of the Peace, a former slave. First Lieutenant James D. Dudley was a lieutenant, a former sergeant in the 14th U.S. Heavy Artillery, and then second lieutenant in the militia was Isaac B. Abbott, who was a carpenter, free-born, and a servant to a Confederate officer. All were Republicans in the city, county, and statewide. These three men served either as delegates to the founding Black state conventions of 1865 and 1866 and worked in the state legislature under the authority of 1868 under the authority of the 1868 Constitution and had voted for Holden that year to be governor. Willis also founded such black institutions as Rood Chapel, American Methodist Episcopal Church, and King Solomon's Lodge. The officers and men of Company H connected Craven County's black demographic, civic, and political power to North Carolina's militia service, something South Carolina blacks also exercised statewide. The black militia service would continue in the 1870s as the Democratic Party first gained control of state government and then experimented with white supremacy in the 1880s and 1890s. Democrats then consolidated their reign in North Carolina after the Spanish-American War. The role of black North Carolina militiamen would shrink in the 1870s into the 1880s in parallel to the decline of Republican Party power and the strengthening of white supremacy and Democratic Party hegemony. 3 newspaper histories of North Carolina's militia chronicle the rise of white supremacy and Democratic Party power. According to one history, the watershed between Republican Party and Democratic Party visions of the North Carolina militia was 1877, when the Democrats got possession of the state. Democratic rule made everything in the way of the militia was at an end. Say for the 5 Democratic white power bases, Fayetteville, Charlotte, Wilmington, New Bern, and Raleigh, where 6 volunteer white companies upheld the last vestiges of the militia's antebellum and post-Civil War tradition. The other militia organizations, mainly colored, were worthless. The late 1870s marked the triumph of Democratic Party control of North Carolina government. Governor Zebulon B. Vance authorized the state militia reorganization on March 12, 1877, creating the State Guard. Vance ordered the collection of arms from a number of organizations, among these many Negro companies at Wilmington, 6 or 7, there along with the revoking of all commissions before January 1st, 1877. On November 8th, 1877, Vance's order recreated the State Guard. The State Guard in 1878 then included colored companies in the 4th and 5th battalions, amounting to about 500 black men, including 35th USCT veteran Samuel Osborne Mason. Mason was a blacksmith, a leader, and institution builder. Governor Vance commissioned Mason in 1877 during the reorganization. Governor Jarvis later promoted Mason to captain. White battalions under Democratic Party reorganization and white supremacy grew so large that the state was home to 2 all-white regiments, doubling the dwarfing of the all-black units that dwindled from the reorganization continually to the 43 members of the only colored company in the Guard in 1894, for 4 years before the Spanish-American War of 1898. In 1899, North Carolina's legislature enacted a law eliminating colored companies from the Guard. Even though the black press praised North Carolina for setting the example for the South by sending into the field an entire battalion, actually a regiment, of Negro troops with Negro officers from major down. Black North Carolinian patriots helped to preserve, the Washington Post noted, a white man's country during their Spanish-American War service. South Carolina, unlike North Carolina, had a majority black population in 1865. There were 400,000 black South Carolinians. Blacks outnumbered white South Carolinians by 125,000 votes. Liverpool-born Robert Brown Elliott was one of several blacks who viewed South Carolina's demographic advantage as an opportunity to grow. Elliott served less than a year as Assistant Adjutant General. He served as a troubleshooter for the governor before a dispute over the use of militia resources between Elliott and Governor Robert K. Smith resulted in Elliott's resignation. Yet Elliott's power continued to grow. He became a congressman in 1871 and was awarded promotion to major general before he resigned. By 1873, Elliott was part of a commission to reorganize the South Carolina National Guard. The South Carolina Democratic Party won the election of 1877. A year later, they dismantled the South Carolina National Guard in favor of a predominantly white state militia, the South Carolina Volunteers. While militia service in North Carolina ended in 1899, South Carolina's black militiamen continued serving the state, into the 20th century. Yet militia service combined with the Republican Party in North Carolina did not yield a sense of belonging that South Carolina African descendant people attained before 1878. The triumph of white supremacy in both states, working hand in hand with the Democratic Party in each state, eroded and sought to erase the presence of black leadership and hopes for equality as the 19th century ended and a new century, the 20th century, dawned. It would take over 2 generations in the 20th century before black leadership and governance began re-emerging in the Carolinas. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Nixon.
I would like to invite those of you watching this program to submit questions to us at usct@triumphalis.org. An email, and we will respond to your question later on. For me, the dramatic presentation that Mitch Capel gave adds humanity to this important story. I applaud the work that Dr. Smith is doing in a museum that honors this tradition that has been so underrepresented in North Carolina and United States history books. And I am particularly intrigued by the comments of Dr. Mixon about that period after the war that I find particularly interesting, trying to figure out where we are going, particularly as a state. I will recommend to all of you listening the exhibit at the North Carolina Museum of History called The Story of North Carolina. Contains one of my favorite artifacts, a very small quill pen that was used in drafting the North Carolina Constitution of 1868. A small object with a very powerful meaning. Craig, do you have any reflections on what we've heard?
Yes, Bill, in fact, the last one, Dr. Mixon mentioned 2 buildings that's still in existence here in New Bern. That's Ruth Chapel AME Church and King Solomon Lodge. And the sad part about it is Ruth Chapel Church has a for sale sign in front of it now. I don't know if people really know the history of that church and what could be done with it. It should be put in the archives and a museum at least. In King Solomon Lodge, I believe they're now working on it to restore the King Solomon Lodge. So hopefully the work could continue on that and we move forward on those 2 buildings here in New Bern. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you for being the moderator on our first panel session. We are going to present a short video, and then we will return for our second session. Thank you.
First part. Okay. I don't know if I can see it that far. Yeah. Okay. I was thinking the same thing out there. It's like, it sound kind of muffled. Right? I haven't seen that yet.
Welcome back. Our second session is entitled An Eagle on His Button. Our moderator for this segment is David Terrell, who you saw in the first video that we just played. David?
Thank you, Bill. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Bernard George. Mr. Bernard George is a retired city planner and founding member of the 35th USCT Living History Reenactment Group. Mr. George is a native New Bernian and an avid historian who traces his Craven County's family roots back to the early 1700s. He was a charter member of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission and served for several years on the New Bern Historical Society Board of Directors. He holds a BA degree in political science from North Carolina Central University and has pursued graduate studies in health facilities administration at Webster University in St. Louis, Missouri, in addition to municipal administration and urban planning at the University of North Carolina School of Government. He presently serves on the Tryon Palace Foundation, the Tryon Palace Commission, and the African American Advisory Committee. Welcome, Mr. Bernard George. Mr. George, would you please unmute yourself?
How about now? Can you hear me?
Okay, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. As I was saying, a little background, I'm going to talk about the 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteers, later known as the 35th United States Colored Troops, and our relationship with Tryon Palace and their attempts to make the unit a living example of what Civil War history is all about, making history come alive. As I said, my family goes back several generations here in Craven County. In fact, my family's been traced back to about 1640 in Tidewater, Virginia. Strangely enough, my family has been basically free since that point. Ancestor of mine bought his freedom. And we've basically moved here in eastern North Carolina in the Hollow, Adams Creek area, moved there in the early 1700s and have been there ever since. In 1790, the census of this country revealed that there were close to 750,000 African Americans here in this country, 20% of the population of this country was African American. When this country's census was made in 1790, my family's name is included on there. One of the Georges, Theophilus George, great grandfather mine 5 times removed, is on that. And we also trace our heritage back to the colonial period and the colonial militia. So I have very deep roots here in this town, in this county, and those roots have given me an additional impetus to do research on the African American experience here in New Bern and Craven County. In fact, the great historian of the 20th century stated that New Bern, eastern North Carolina, has some of the most comprehensive African American history in this country. And we're finding that out. I think we've had several speakers to speak on it. And the history of African Americans runs very deep here in New Bern and in Craven County. In fact, one of my mottos is the New Bern African American community history, North Carolina's best kept secret. We have a very extensive history. In fact, the Harlow Patriots, who were recognized, 14 patriots recognized by the Sons of the American Revolution, researched them, and about 4 or 5 years ago, they became a chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, the only chapter in this entire country named after an African American patriot and composed of a majority of African American members. That's the kind of history that we have, and that's the kind of history that I love researching and sharing with the public. Now let's fast forward. I know I don't have much time, and it's a lot of area to cover, and I'm going to just give you a bit of it, because if you want to know more, you need to come back and visit us here at Tryon Palace, and these wonderful reenactors, these historical interpreters can give you some more detailed information. I just want to wet your whistle a little and encourage you to come back. I don't know how well my PowerPoint is working. Can you see it? No? It's not showing up. How about now? Can you see it? Well, we're not going to worry about it. This program this morning, An Eagle on His Button, the North Carolina Connection, and my particular topic, Tryon Palace and the 35th United States Colored Troops. You know, as I've stated, African Americans fought for our country's freedom over 200 years ago. We were part of George Washington's army, and we were also part of the British Army also. Whoever promised freedom as enslaved people, we were willing to fight. Just a bit about New Bern prior to the Civil War. New Bern was a busy coastal trading hub with new mills and rail connections. Rail connector was connected here, I think, in 1857, connecting Moorhead, Beaufort to New Bern, and to points west. We had 68 manufacturing establishments, including 47 turpentine operations. New Bern was the urban center for about 100 years of North Carolina. The 1860 census shows that there were 6,189 slaves and 1,332 free people in Craven County. 179 of the county's free blacks were prosperous enough to list property of their very own. Within the city of New Bern, free African Americans comprised 12 to 13% of the population. Think about that. This is in the antebellum period. And this is according to historian Alan Watson. This is by far the greatest number of free blacks of any town in North Carolina. So we get the idea now. New Bern and Craven County had more free blacks than any other area in this state. They were attracted to this city because of the area and because we also had the colonial and state government here, and things were probably a bit more liberal. Urban slavery is a bit more liberal than agricultural slavery, which is more of an industrial operation. So that's how things looked at the turn of the Civil War, at the beginning of the Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln did not want to base the law on the freeing of the slaves. The war was based on keeping the Union, the federal government unified, keeping the country unified. He said if he would free one, if it required keeping all the slaves enslaved, and that's what he would do, or if it required freedom, that's what he would do. His ultimate decision, his ultimate choice was to save the Union. But all that changed somewhat with General Burnside's expedition in March of 1862 to New Bern, where New Bern was captured because of its strategic railroad that came through here, and also that railroad was a major supplier of General Robert Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. It was said that Eastern North Carolina, this area, was the breadbasket of his Confederate troops. Well, when General Burnside, some said captured, I say liberated New Bern, over 7,500 refugees sought freedom in New Bern behind the Union lines. And this was done throughout the country, as wherever the Union Army went, enslaved people knew if they could get to the Union lines, there's a great opportunity to find, to be safe, to find sanctuary, and working for the war effort and earning a living. When as folk flocked to New Bern, there were several important people who immigrated to New Bern. Among them, Abraham Galloway, a runaway slave who had left Wilmington, Southport, ran away to Philadelphia, made his way all the way up to Canada, and then came back at the beginning of the Civil War to do whatever he could to strike a blow for freedom. There was also J.C. Price, who was a young man who escaped, his family escaped from Elizabeth City and sought refuge here in New Bern. And then found there was Reverend James Walker Hood, a New England AME Zion minister, evangelist who came to New Bern and planted churches here in Eastern North Carolina. In fact, North Carolina has more AME Zion churches than any other place in the country, any other state in the country. He did a tremendous job, and as was recently spoken, I think, by one of the panelists, that our Constitution, how important it was. I think you mentioned that, Jim. The Constitution was important. It was so important, in fact, and Reverend James Walker Hood had so much to do with it, they called it Hood's Constitution. But anyway, enough of that. But these were the people who came to New Bern and who put their shoulders to the plow and began to make our city and our state and our country live up to the words of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed with their Creator, with certain unalienable rights, among them a life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And just after the Emancipation Proclamation, you know, we had Gettysburg, in which Lincoln declared a new birth to freedom, and the Emancipation Proclamation itself expanded the ideas of war to the point where it was no longer a fight to hold the country together, but it was taken to a higher moral plane. It was a fight to eliminate slavery. There was a book, The Enslavement of Joseph, to free our brother. And this fight was what re-energized the Union, brought in over 200,000 African-American soldiers and sailors, and gave the push, the incentive to win the war. That's quite a charge, isn't it? Well, there were others who came here. You know, we're looking at, I think, around the, in about 10 days, we'll be seeing the anniversary, the 58th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was originally preliminarily issued on September 22nd, 1863. And Lincoln had decided already that he was going to issue it, but he was advised by his cabinet because actually the Union was getting its butt kicked in battle after battle. And they told him that to issue such an edict would appear to be the motives of someone without hope. So they urged him to wait until there was a significant battle won by the federal forces. And that battle was the Battle of Antietam. That was 158 years ago. Antietam, the bloodiest day in American military history, occurred during that battle in Antietam, Maryland, when General Robert Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was defeated or stopped by Union General George McClellan. In just 12 hours of intense and often close-range fighting with muskets and cannons, it resulted in around 23,000 casualties, including an estimated 3,650 dead. 10 days later, September 22nd, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued his historic Emancipation Proclamation, stating that in 100 days, those areas under rebellion, the slaves there would be freed. And not only that, but he allowed African Americans, for the first time since about 1790, officially, to fight in the United States military. That move also ended any hope of France and Great Britain acknowledging the Confederacy and coming to their aid. The Confederacy was holding out that those two industrial giants across the sea and the rest of Europe would need their cotton and other agricultural products and would come to their aid. But as the war became a moral war, a war against slavery, the subjugation of our fellow humans, it took on a higher moral stand. And those countries remained out of the fray throughout the war. By the end of the Civil War, United States colored troops, that's what they were called, fought and died in every major campaign of the 1864-1865 year, except Sherman's invasion of Georgia. Amazingly, as further evidence of the military value of Black troops during the federal war effort, on March 13, 1865, the Congress of the Confederate States of America passed, and President Jefferson Davis signed into law General Order 14, allowing the enlistment of slaves with the promise of freedom. Alas, too little, too late. Now let me talk briefly about the 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteer Regiment, its recruitment, training, and battle record. The 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteer Regiment was organized here in New Bern. When the one-armed, charismatic General Edward A. Wild arrived in New Bern in mid-May of 1863. He was accompanied by one of the most experienced and competent staff of officers that would lead any of the 139 Black regiments during the Civil War. He was fresh from successful efforts to organize and recruit the famous Black Massachusetts 54th and 55th regiments. General Wild was innovative in gathering the best staff that he could find. And in that staff, he had the most progressive staff of any unit. He was charged with raising 4 regiments of an African brigade of 4,000 soldiers in the Department of North Carolina. Well, at first, recruitment was extremely slow. Sometimes Union soldiers were as racist and mean and extremely harsh to African Americans as Confederates were. However, there was a local leader, a charismatic leader and freedom fighter by the name of Abraham Galloway from Southport. And when they approached him and he negotiated in a closed room in the dead of night without light, very intense situation. But he gave his approval of the recruitment efforts upon the successful negotiating with the military leaders, fair pay, for Black recruits, and the assurances of financial support for the soldiers' families during deployment. With New Bern serving as the recruitment headquarters of this historic military undertaking, more than 6,000 African Americans enlisted in the Union Army as United States colored troops. Yes, the Emancipation Proclamation authorized recruitment of Black volunteers for federal service beginning January 1st, 1863. And it was felt that more recruits could be influenced by the success of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. In fact, Massachusetts Governor John Andrew, who was a staunch abolitionist, obtained the services of General Edward A. Wild for recruiting the former slaves in the occupied northeastern North Carolina. Was targeted because since the very beginning of New Bern's occupation in March 1862, thousands and thousands of escaped slaves had poured behind the line seeking freedom and aid. New Bern's large Black population and strong support for the Union made it an ideal location for a recruiting station. I'm going to briefly talk about the men of the regiment. We all know that General Wild was a regimental commander. Well, he was a brigade commander, excuse me. But he enlisted the aid of Colonel James C. Beecher, brother of author Harriet Beecher Stowe of Uncle Tom's Cabin fame. Colonel Beecher was a regimental commander of the 35th United States Colored Troops, earlier known as the 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteers. General Wild also reached out and solicited the support of Lieutenant Colonel William N. Reed, the regiment's second in command. He was a seasoned German-trained officer. Many sources describe him as a mulatto, although the Army had an official policy prohibiting the appointment of African-American officers in command positions. Surprisingly, Colonel Beecher's original staff also included Major John Van Surrey de Grasse, the nation's first Black surgeon admitted to a medical society and only the second African-American to gain a medical degree. He was the only Black doctor to serve in a field unit during the Civil War. Unusual indeed was an additional Black officer, the Reverend John N. Mars, selected to be the first North Carolina Colored Volunteers Regiment's black chaplain. And then, of course, there was our local hero, William Henry Singleton, an escaped slave from Adams Creek, born here in New Bern, raised down there, and escaped there and was sold off several times. Finally made his way back from Atlanta at only 8 years old to be hidden in his mother's potato bin for 3 years before being found out again. Man, these people, these men, had something extra. They were cut from a cloth like no other. William Henry Singleton, although could not read and write, he was taught to read and write by Harriet Beecher Stowe and Colonel Beecher's wife, and Colonel Beecher himself, who spent many hours teaching these men to write, so that by the end of their enlistment, when they mustered out in 1866, most of them could at least write their names. Well, while white soldiers from the 45th Massachusetts Regiment aided in training, although the top officers in the 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteers were white, company commanders chose promising enlisted black men to serve as sergeants and corporals. And upon their completion of training, during a farewell ceremony held at the Academy Green here in New Bern, the New Bern Academy, on July 24th, 1863, the Colored Ladies Relief Association of New Bern presented the regiment with a silk battle flag. That's the pride this city had for its black sable soldiers. Within a short time, the existing black units received orders for Charleston. Officials continued to recruit for the 2nd and 3rd North Carolina Colored Volunteers, and eventually recruited for the 14th Heavy Artillery Unit that was stationed in Beaufort and Moorhead during the remaining of the war. The 3 regiments were intended to form a single brigade. However, it never happened. They were broken up and sent here and there. But we do know that the 35th ended up going to near Fort Sumter and performed some of the work there, the duty there with the 54th Massachusetts. And then the regiment was to prove both brave and reliable in battle, according to reports. The regiment spent several months in Farley Island, outside of Charleston, near Fort Sumter. But on February 8th, 1864, federal authorities redesignated the 1st North Carolina Colored Troops, redesignated them as the 35th United States Colored Troops. The regiment soon deployed to Florida, where it fought at the Battle of Olustee, the only major battle fought in Florida. One report stated that no regiment went into action more gallantly or did better execution than the 35th. Though the battle itself was a federal defeat, the regiment's valor played an important role in changing white attitude about the capabilities of black troops. Despite heavy losses, the 35th served for the duration of the war. And some of the first thousands of Southern black volunteers, including more than 6,000 from North Carolina, the 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteers, paved the way in demonstrating to the nation the importance of black soldiers who fought for their freedom and the preservation of our country. Now, I'm going to just speak very briefly about Tryon Palace and the United States Colored Troops Reenactment Group. A famous statement by Frederick Douglass an eagle on his button, which is the name of our program, states, once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters, U.S., let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pockets, and there is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship in the United States. In 2016, Tryon Palace Foundation received an Institute of Museum and Library Services grant to form an interpretive program based on the experiences of the United States colored troops during the American Civil War. As a result, the U.S. Colored Troops 35th Regimental Reenactment Group was born, with a mission to promote a better understanding of the role of African Americans in the Civil War, the fight for their freedom. The 35th USCT gathers and interprets the stories of soldiers who served in the original regiment. And these stories are often told by some of their actual descendants. The 35th USCT Enactment Group has traveled throughout North Carolina, into Virginia, South Carolina, as well as by invitation to the African American Civil War Museum, thank you, Frank Smith, in Washington, D.C. The group actively welcomes new volunteers to help tell the story. Now, for the past 4 years, since 2016, we've had about 30 local men and boys who have been on a historical journey through the Civil War, Reconstruction, and beyond. We have discovered fascinating New Bern African American Civil War history that has either been hidden or unwritten or rewritten. We are dedicated living historians of the truth, the whole truth of the Civil War history, the whole truth of our nation's history, and the important role of African American soldiers in the preservation of our country and the democratic ideas and visions of our Constitution. Each person, each of those 30 or more people, has done research and identified many African American patriots who fought, suffered, and died for this country and the principles of liberty, justice, and equality for all citizens. Perhaps one or more of your ancestors served among the more than 6,000 Eastern North Carolina soldiers of African American descent who served in the Civil War and in the Union Army. It is said, if you don't like the story, then write your own. We choose to write and tell the true story of the rich African American history of New Bern, Craven County, Eastern North Carolina, and of this nation. We invite you to be part of this magnificent project by joining or actively supporting the United States Colored Troops Living History and Reenactment Group. Now, I'd like to just thank Tryon Palace. I'd like to recognize the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, its director, also the Tryon Palace Commission with Bill Cannon at its head. They have given us great support. Ms. Tyson, chairman of the Tryon Palace Foundation. Dr. Denard, just retired from ECU's History Department, a staunch supporter of New Bern's African American history and an important part of this program and project, along with the Tryon Palace African American Advisory Committee. We also thank Executive Director Bill McCree and his support and the wonderful Tryon Palace staff. But most importantly, we want to thank Ms. Sharon Bryant, African American Outreach Coordinator and USCT Project Coordinator. She has been a wonderful, dedicated leader who has worked tirelessly and most graciously over these several years to make this important project an outstanding success. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Ms. Sharon Bryant. I do have some references here in my PowerPoint. We had some technical problems with it, but please contact me should you like to get these references and my bibliography. I have, as you see, I'm in my den. This is what I do. And this is what I love. Thank you very much, Mr. Darrow. And I turn the mic back over to you.
Thank you, Mr. George, for your outstanding talking about the 35th. You've been the single biggest mentor for me in terms of becoming the living history historian that I have become over these last few years. And it's now my pleasure to introduce another person who has really taught me a lot about the 35th and USCTs in general. Ms. Geraldine James Lee. Ms. Lee is a native of Chicago, Illinois, and currently resides in Mount Olive, North Carolina. Geraldine is an honor graduate of St. Thomas Apostle High School in Chicago and a summa cum laude graduate of the University of Mount Olive with a BS in Business Administration. She also holds certification from the University of Maryland in Executive Management, where she taught a summer session from 2003 to 2013 at the University of Maryland, University College in College Park, Maryland, and at the Texas Women's University in Denton, Texas. Geraldine was employed with UniFirst Corporation for 37 years. She retired in 2012 as Regional Human Resources Manager for the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast regions. She returned to the workforce in 2014 as Human Resources Director for Wayne County and recently retired again in July 2019. Geraldine previously served on the Board of Directors for the North Carolina Association of Textile Services, the North Carolina Statewide Safety Conference Council, the Eastern Carolina Safety Council, the Business Advisory Council for Wayne Community College, and she is a past president of both the Wayne County Human Resources Association and the University of Mount Olive Alumni Association. Geraldine currently serves on the Board of Trustees for the University of Mount Olive, the Advisory Board for Southern Bank, and the Business Advisory Board for Wayne Community College. She is a 2019 recipient of the Order of the Longleaf Pine Award, the highest award for service in the state of North Carolina. She is a frequent speaker on the American Civil War with an emphasis on the United States colored troops. Geraldine is a member of the St. Mary of Angels Catholic Church in Mount Olive and serves as chairman of the Finance Council. She and her husband, Kenneth, have 3 daughters, 2 grandsons, and 1 granddaughter. It is my pleasure to welcome Geraldine at this time.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, David. I appreciate that nice introduction. I am honored to participate in this year's symposium, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about the North Carolina Colored Troops and a few of their stories. And I have about 15 minutes to pack in a lot of information, and I have it scripted, so I won't dally. North Carolina had some of the earliest regiments to enter the Civil War. 4 of those regiments, the 35th, 36th, 37th, and the 14th Heavy Artillery, were quickly established as part of Wild's Brigade. And toward the end of the war, North Carolina gained another infantry regiment, the 135th. So my plan here today is to talk about how those regiments formed and I'll share some individual stories about a few of those North Carolina regimental soldiers. All of Eastern North Carolina, like the rest of the South, was destabilized because of the war. Most young white men joined the Confederacy, and most young Black men were hearing rumors about serving in the Army. General Burnside tried to reassure the Southern population, saying, "The mission of our joint expedition is not to invade any of your rights, nor liberate your slaves." But of course, that soon would change. Enslaved Blacks saw and heard what was going on, and New Bern, North Carolina exploded as a central point of refuge and escape. The Black population in New Bern increased fivefold from 1860 to 1862. The first Blacks to assist in the Union Army were not actually soldiers. Their mission was to penetrate rebel picket lines, observe enemy military camps, and gather information about Confederate movements. Slaves and free men knew the back roads, the waterways, and the swamps of North Carolina. The superintendent of Negro Affairs in New Bern wrote, "Upwards of 50 volunteers of the best and most courageous were kept constantly employed in the perilous but important duties of spies, scouts, and guides. They went from 30 to 300 miles within the enemy lines." He called them invaluable, almost indispensable. Two of the first and most prominent scouts were Abraham Galloway and William Henry Singleton, as our previous speaker mentioned. Galloway escaped slavery in 1857. He was working with the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia prior to returning home to North Carolina. He became the spokesman for over 10,000 free and escaped slaves in Craven County, organizing them for entry into the war. Abraham Galloway met with Edward Kingsley, who was a special envoy to President Lincoln and Governor Andrews of Massachusetts. But before Galloway would ensure their commitment, there were 4 conditions that had to be met. Number 1, the men had to receive equal pay to the Massachusetts regiments. 2, while they were serving, the Army had to provide for their families because most of them were almost all refugees. Number 3, the Freedmen's Bureau had to set up schools to teach their children to read and write in preparation for things after the war. And most importantly, number 4, the U.S. government must guarantee that in the event of capture, they would have all the rights of legitimate military prisoners of war. Of course, we know from history that didn't happen. The Confederacy, as their racial code, called for immediate execution, no quarter. It was not until the last year and a half of the war that they were accepted as prisoners of war, with treatment so poor that many of them died before the war was actually over. One of Galloway's recruits was Henry Singleton. He volunteered as a guide and informant. He entered the 35th Regiment as a sergeant because of his prior training with the 1st North Carolina Cavalry, not colored. The regiment included Virginians, both free and enslaved. The Army established the Trent River Contraband Camp to house them and their families, and appointed Horace James, a chaplain from Massachusetts, as the superintendent of Negro Affairs for the North Carolina district. He directed operations at the contraband camp, setting up classes for former slaves and organized work details. The community of James City is still in existence right outside of New Bern. The U.S. Army sent officers and non-commissioned officers from the 54th and the 55th Massachusetts Regiment to train men as they prepared to participate in the Siege of Charleston. Two of the earliest Black officers of the 35th were Major John DeGrasse, a physician, and Reverend John Mars. Reverend Mars soon took ill, and he was replaced with a white chaplain. Dr. DeGrasse was dismissed from the regiment on grounds of intoxication, but other historical records show that Dr. DeGrasse was dismissed for being insubordinate to a white officer, even though he himself held the rank of major. In 1864, the 35th was sent to Florida as part of a campaign led by Brigadier General Truman Seymour. They participated in the Battle of Olustee in Florida on February 20th. The regiment was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William Reed and Major Archibald Bogle. Reed, who was the son of a Black enslaved mother and a Danish settler of the West Indies, was second in command of the 35th, and at the time, the highest ranking African-American officer, attaining the rank of lieutenant colonel. But unfortunately, he was wounded at the Battle of Olustee and died 6 days later. The 35th and the 54th Massachusetts lost more than 200 men at Olustee. In April, the following conflict and the Battle of Port Hudson, President Abraham Lincoln said, "There have been men who have proposed to me to return to slavery, the black warriors of Port Hudson and Olustee to their masters, affiliate the South. I should be damned in time and eternity for doing so." The 2nd North Carolina Colored Volunteers was established on December 6, 1863, with Colonel Alonzo Draper in command and Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Pratt second in command. The regiment was designated as the 36th United States Colored Troops on February 8, 1864. Most historians say that of all the North Carolina regiments, the 35th was the best trained, but the members of the 36th showed what they were made of too during the Richmond campaign. Miles James was one of the soldiers of the 36th. He was born a slave. By age 34, he was serving as a corporal in Company B. In 1864, he was badly hurt at the Battle of Chapin's Farm. His commanding officer said these words, "He was hit in his left arm and he suffered a field amputation. They take his arm off in the field and he gets up and picks up his pistol and continues to lead the charge." Corporal James was later promoted to sergeant and was given the Medal of Honor. He was taken to Fort Monroe for medical treatment, and he asked permission to stay in the Army. He was granted permission and given a sword instead of a musket. But eventually, his wounds got the best of him, and he received a disability discharge and moved back home to Norfolk. Another one of the well-known soldiers from that regiment was Sergeant James Daniel Gardner, born a free man in Gloucester, Virginia. Gardner joined the 2nd North Carolina Colored Volunteers in 1863, and he was also there at Chapin's Farm. As the regiment marched towards Signal Hill after the first assault, Gardner ran ahead of his unit and shot a Confederate officer who was standing on top of the hill. And after shooting the officer, Gardner ran him through with his bayonet for good measure. This earned him a promotion to sergeant and 2 prestigious honors, both the Medal of Honor and the Butler Medal. The company muster roll recorded promoted to sergeant for heroic conduct, dated September 30th, 1864. The regiment lost 8 officers and 79 enlisted men during service, either killed or mortally wounded, and 5 officers and 132 enlisted men died from disease. 10 soldiers from the 36th went on to serve in the Buffalo Soldiers, and 3 of those officers went on to serve in the regular army after the regiment mustered out in Texas. War correspondent Thomas Chester Morris called the soldiers of the 36th a model regiment. We know the service records of the 37th, but there's not a lot of information about individual soldiers in the regiment. The 37th organized late in February of 1864 from the 3rd North Carolina Colored Volunteers under the command of Colonel Nathan Goff, previously in command of the 22nd USCT. Shown here are pictures of the colonel as well as soldiers from the 37th manning an earth and brick structure at Fort Pocahontas, and soldiers from the 37th at their tents in Fort Harrison. The formation of the regiment was haphazard at best and very slow to form. The men for the 37th were recruited in North Carolina, but then sent to Norfolk, Virginia for formation. The 35th and the 36th had already been dispatched to other states. The regiment was soon transferred to the command of Lieutenant Colonel Abiel Chamberlain from Massachusetts, and all 11 officers of the 37th came from the 1st Massachusetts Volunteers. The 37th saw duty with General Butler in Petersburg and Richmond and participated in the capture of Fort Pocahontas, defeating Robert E. Lee's nephew, General Fitzhugh Lee. When they returned to North Carolina, they participated in the capture of Fort Fisher near Carolina Beach, along with the 55th Massachusetts. They were also part of the advance on Goldsboro and Kinston and Raleigh. In contrast to the infantry regiments, the 1st North Carolina Colored Heavy Artillery was never properly trained for combat. They were to be used for artillery only in case of emergency. The regiment became a necessary labor force that could easily be utilized more so than civilians. Organization of the regiment began in February through late March of 1864, and they were federally designated as the 14th USCT Heavy Artillery. Wild's brigade had envisioned a prototype that would demonstrate the capabilities of Black soldiers, but instead this artillery unit was created to take care of local concerns and later even used for the needs of Army bureaucrats. It was organized specifically to man permanent fortifications, and it was useful in handling logistical needs of the Army in eastern North Carolina, which also meant that the regiment would not likely leave the area. The regiment did not fill all of its companies until the war was almost over, and it went through a succession of leadership, adding to the disorganization of the regiment. And officers were appointed who acted more like recruiters in order to bring in federal dollars than paying attention to training the troops. The use of commissions for purposes unconnected to the regiment only added to the aggravation of its shortage of leadership, and it lowered morale within the ranks. Things finally seemed to settle down under the command of Lieutenant Frank Welch, formerly of the 54th Massachusetts, but he didn't arrive until early 1865. He was one of the first Black soldiers promoted to a commissioned rank in the United States Colored Troops, and my own maternal great-great-grandfather served with the 14th while they were garrisoned at Fort Macon. The 135th was organized in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and mustered in on March 28, 1865. The regiment enlisted men from every southern state east of the Mississippi River, and it was carried as a North Carolina regiment only because it was organized in North Carolina. They were mainly garrisoned in North Carolina, and they participated in the Grand Review of the Armies that May. The regiment mustered out in Kentucky on October 23, 1865. Their engagement was brief, but there is a group of dedicated researchers in Goldsboro who are reconstructing the 135th, and at least two of the reenactors from the 135th are direct descendants of the soldiers from that regiment. And there are plans in the future for a monument to be erected in their honor in Goldsboro. The 37th Regiment from North Carolina played an instrumental part in the Second Battle of Fort Fisher. The First Battle of Fort Fisher was a debacle for the Union due to a series of missteps by General Butler and Commander Rhind of the Navy. But the 37th and the 5th USCT regiments led the advance during the Second Battle at Fort Fisher. They, along with the 27th and sailors from the USS Triton, took Fort Fisher and claimed the final seaport from the Confederacy. Once Fort Fisher was under Union control, the fight ensued for the city of Wilmington. Several regiments of USCT fought at the Battle of Forks Road, including the 4th, 5th, the 27th, the 54th, and North Carolina's own 37th. The last metropolitan stronghold of the South had finally been won. If you have more interest in the information I presented, here's a list of primary book resources that I used, and also internet resources that I used. And I think that my time is about up, and I'll be available for questions later in this presentation. And thanks to all of you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Geraldine, for that outstanding reenactment of what our regiments were in North Carolina, which is very important to us here in North Carolina. Since you enjoy USCT history, I invite you to go on Geraldine's USCT Facebook page group that she has created, and you can get daily information about USCT throughout the nation. Okay, now at this time, I'm going to introduce Mr. Chris Minkins. Mr. Minkins is a research historian with the North Carolina State Library and Archives. He holds a BA and an MA in history from North Carolina State University. He is the editor for the Civil War Roster Project at the North Carolina Department of Cultural and Natural Resources. Welcome, Mr. Chris Minkins.
Thank you. I've enjoyed listening to the other panelists this morning, and this very nice symposium put together, and I'm going to jump right in it. I do have a little bit of information to cover and a little bit of time to do that. So let's jump right in. There's my contact information at the bottom of the screen there. My email, just my name, Christoph Meekins at ncdcr.gov. I was trained as a reference archivist and did that work for 19 years and have recently moved and exploring the other part of my public historian role, and that is as an editor and just happened to be with the Civil War Roster Project. I've been studying the Civil War for way too long now. I do believe it is a big well that you crawl in and cannot get out of. And the men who have populated the United States Color Troops and the heavy artillery are a fascinating story, and I'm glad we're telling more of it. But today what I'm going to do is just sort of take you through some basics of genealogical research and how to maybe verify if your ancestor has served and the things that you can do to do that. So post 1865, genealogical research is the same for any ethnic group. Prior to that, you have more challenges in African Americans, particularly if they were enslaved people. But the three big touchstones that would help you prove veteran service would be the 1890 soldier census, the 1910 population schedule, and the 1930 population schedule. Now, not many vets make it to 1930, but if your vet did, that's great. The 1890 soldier census is just a census for soldiers. So if you find your ancestor listed in that census, then it will state their exact service, what unit they joined, when they joined, how long they served. In the population schedule, there's a particular question that asks if you were a veteran. And if you were a veteran, then it asks you, did you serve in the CS or the US? And then by 1930, they'd had a few more wars fought. And that question went out, if you were a veteran, did you fight in the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, something called the Mexican Expeditionary Force, which, if you know a little history, Pancho Villa in 1914 out west, and then the First World War, or sometimes the Great War. Another great resource that you can find on Ancestry.com are headstone requests. Service as a soldier or a sailor, you could ask for a free headstone, and they kept the records of that. And so you can search for your ancestor in those, and it'll give you such great information, like the cemetery they were buried in was the GAR cemetery in Elizabeth City, which is, I think, called Oak Grove, and the date of death, and even the company that supplied the headstone. And you can see an example of a headstone on the right. And then a little bit later, those same applications for headstones got a lot more information in them. So these are great jumping off spots that you can find service information about your ancestor. Now, another great source is the National Archives and Records Administration, what we call NARA. And if you go to the Archives Administration webpage, you'll see the search engine up here on the right that I've just highlighted. Type in United States Colored Troops or your United States Colored Infantry, and it will pull up this essay, Preserving a Legacy, which is a great look at what the National Archives is doing to preserve the records of the service of your ancestors. So that is a great way to get into this process if you haven't done it before. And you can see there at the bottom of the page the link, the URL for the archives. You can also just search the National Archives and Records Administration on your favorite search engine. It'll take you to that page. So another great resource is something that was something that Howard University and the National Park Service collaborated together on. And you can go here to this link and you can search for Civil War soldiers and sailors database, and it will come up on your search engine. Here we're going to see the second end, there's a people with a down arrow. We're going to go to that, and it'll take you to these various databases. You can see soldiers, sailors, you can get information about the regiment that they served in. Now, the soldiers will take you through by name, and you can search by name. The sailors also give you an option of searching by location. So if you wanted to know, all the men from Craven County who were sailors, you can look for Craven County, but then I would advise you to also be, smart in your look and know that they may be listed as born in New Bern, which is Craven County, but so you just, and then the other small municipalities in Craven County. So just broaden your search a little bit, and that will help you get to that information. Here's another great resource. This is Fold 3. And Fold 3 has all sorts of wonderful records, but they have a really great and growing collection of military service records. Earlier, we heard a presenter talk about a Revolutionary War service. Your ancestor may have served in any of the wars, but here's a place you can go to find out information about all of them, all of the different wars. And North Carolina has participated in every war on American soil or that America fought in. So if you have a North Carolina background and ancestry, chances are if they were the right military age, they will have served in a war. When you're in Fold 3, and if you can see to the left of the screen that I have, or probably to the right of the screen, Civil War highlighted, and there's information under the Civil War. Now, the place you really want to go are Civil War service records. But you can see also there's a reference for Civil War Massachusetts 54th Infantry, which we've heard other speakers talk about. Again, these records are going to be by surname and given name. And so if you have those of your ancestor, which brings up a point, if you're at all familiar with researching an African-American genealogy, you know that sometimes after that emancipation moment, they took a new surname. Or it could have been later they took a surname, or they took an alias during the war, so their former owner couldn't find them and try to re-enslave them. So it could be a little tricky in finding that name, but just keep those things in mind when you're looking for an ancestor, and that will help you. There's a pension index. This is an example of the service cards that you can find, and look at the wealth of information that's in them. You can see that this man was born in Pasquotank County. He enlisted in Plymouth. He was 27 years old, the date he enlisted, and then there are other pieces of his service. So most compiled service cards will have several items in it. Sometimes the card is just a muster roll item, and it says that they were on active duty during these 2 months. But it's still a great resource to check and see, and you can get more information. And then you can take that and you can say, okay, well, my ancestor was living in Plymouth or was born in Pasquotank. Maybe I need to look there for more records. This is the naval piece of that database, same database. The Navy's widow certificates, the Navy's widow's originals, Navy survivor certificates are what they call their pension records. And then there's the enlistment returns and just all sorts of good things about the Navy records. You can find lots of individuals there. I've been recently looking at individuals who freed themselves and ran out to whatever United States ship was on coastal duty. And once they called that a rendezvous site. Once they got to the boat, they had the option of enlisting in the Navy, and then you can find them listed in that record. Sometimes just looking around on the internet itself, and you'll come across databases and things that other people have compiled. This is the United States Colored Troops formed in North Carolina. These people have done a lot of great work organizing this information for you. And so my caution with this is someone else's interpretation of an original record. So it's their transcription. And when you look at it, just be aware. I kind of use these like breadcrumbs is what I call it. So you want to take these and look at it. It's the old Russian proverb, trust but verify. So we want to trust what they've done, but we want to verify it. And that could be something as simple as a variance in a name spelling or that sort of thing. You can also now access lots of newspaper databases, and you can find all sorts of great information in newspapers. Newspapers.com is a pay subscription, but it's a great service. The Chronicling of America has a newspaper database that you can look at. And then if you just sort of look, if you look at the State Library of North Carolina, they will have different reference pages organized for you, and it'll show you different newspaper databases that you can access. I'm just highlighting here a couple of things I pulled out of the paper to make a couple of different points. The top one is one of my favorite things. These African American men who served in the Civil War. In Elizabeth City, the Emancipation Proclamation was actually in effect on January 1st, 1863. And every year thereafter, all the way into the early 20th century, African Americans in the community would get together, read the Emancipation Proclamation on the steps of the courthouse, and have a parade that day. And they would have a big picnic as well and feed the veterans. And so in the parade in 1920 is the very last glimpse you see of these veterans from the Civil War, African American veterans. They rode in the parade in a cart, in a wagon, because they were too old to walk. But that's a great look at them. And then the other thing you might find in the newspaper is a death announcement. We saw Jacob Spellman earlier in the grave records, and here is a notice that his family is saying thanks for all the sympathy. But newspapers are a great source of information. And then one last 20th century record I want to show you. If your ancestor made it to, say, 1913, which is when the Vital Records Act in North Carolina became law, there's a good chance they have a death certificate. As early as 1909, some counties were doing death certificates. And certainly by 1920, if your ancestor lived that long, there's a really good chance that they have a death certificate. And you have to take it for what it's worth, because the informant is usually one generation away from the actual event itself. So someone did list Jacob Spellman's parents. So here's a man who was born into slavery, and here are his parents listed. So either his informant knew his parents or they're guessing. But again, trust but verify. That's a good place to jump off with. So if you're looking at service records, pension records, census records, vital records, and newspapers, you've gotten a really good start into getting information about your ancestor. That's all I have for you today. And I will turn it over back to our other folks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for that valuable information about the where you can find information about the 35th USCT in archives. I also want to go back and thank Mr. George Bernard for providing us insight into the 35th rich history, which I'm proud to be a part of, reenacting. And also to Geraldine for giving us insight into the other units that, including the 35th, that formed in North Carolina during the Civil War. Okay, at this time, I'll turn it back over to Bill.
David, thank you for moderating this session and for your service to the 35th. I want to remind everyone listening that we are happy to take your email questions at usct@triumphallis.org. We have one more video to share with you, and then we will conclude with our third session.
trying to write you a letter to you for a long time, but we have been training with all the new colored men coming in this army. I've been marching in step with the other, cutting firewood. I am quite well at fighting with my hands and using the sharp edge blade, but I see they use muskets and a shaped blade on the front of the musket. I am the enlisted colored troop men now. I set up camp here in North Carolina. We will be moving home to another location to fight soon. Forward to the sunny days to see you again. I will help to uproot unfair action treatment to colored peoples. I will fight and fight to get back home to Mary. I will send money to you for food. It's hard now, but faith in God will help us win. I am determined to do my part and stop unfair treatment to colored people. I am being trained with bullets and muskets. Wife, soon will I be issued the uniform with the letter U.S. and some more required clothing to fight in this war. I am learning to read, and I want to learn to read. After I leave this fight, we will buy 100 acres of land in Jones County somewhere. I've seen young boys in this war with drums helping out. This called the Little Drummer Boys. If we didn't fight, there will be no pressing forward help at this time. Wife, I still call you baby because you will always be my baby. I wait to get a letter from you and telling me how you are doing. Praise God will help to defeat the evil in the land. I love you forever, your husband.
I'm pleased to welcome you to session 3 of our symposium. The title of this segment is Keepers of the Flame. Our moderator is Julian Tripp, also a member of the 35th Regiment. Julian?
Thank you, Bill. I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Robert Walker. He is a former mayor of Vicksburg, Mississippi, and the first African American to be elected to that position. Mayor Walker holds a BA in History and Political Science from Jackson State and a Master's in History and Political Science from the University of Mississippi. He has done additional graduate work at the University of Mississippi and the University of Louisville. He also has a distinguished record of service as a college and university professor. He was the first African American to teach at the University of Mississippi. He has served as the interim head of history department at Jackson State University, and he has also taught at Tougaloo College, where he was voted outstanding teacher and earned the Tougaloo College Service Award. He has served as a chairman of the African American Monument Committee as well. Welcome, Mr. Robert Carter.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to acknowledge other panelists, the distinguished people who are here this morning, and I'm delighted to share this with you. In addition to that, I want to thank the administration of Towering Place, and certainly Ms. Bryant, Mr. Tyndall, their team, for having simplified things for me, and I feel kind of comfortable now. In addition to that, this monument, while I've worked very hard on it, there were a whole lot of support people in this effort over some 16 years. And I want to acknowledge them and to give them their thanks for their diligence in the struggle. Now, Mr. Tyndall has
several pictures and things, and he would probably put them up on screen so that you can see them. And I'm going to move forward so that I can help us get some of our time back. But the monument, the African American Civil War Monument in Vicksburg, Mississippi, is one that honors and memorializes the contributions of the USDT in the Vicksburg campaign of the war. This monument was unveiled and dedicated during ceremonies on Saturday, February 14, 2004, in the Vicksburg National Military Park. Now, this National Military Park at Vicksburg was established by an act of Congress on February 21, 1899. It's an 1,800-acre park. Count the Vicksburg campaign, the 47-day siege of Vicksburg, and the defense of that city. Over the years, the park has amassed, you can't hear me? You can hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you just fine.
Over the years, okay, good. Over the years, amassed some 1,325 monuments, markers, tablets, and other items that are designed to commemorate the Vicksburg campaign. Now, the African American Civil War Monument is the first monument memorializing the engagement of African Americans to be placed in the entire national park system in this country. Now, I want to a little later clarify that particular statement, but it is the first monument in the entire national park system. The monument is a larger than life-sized sculpture of three figures. Two of them are United States colored troops, and the third figure represents Blacks who aided the Union effort in various capacities, such as spies and in other capacities during the Vicksburg campaign. Those figures are set on a 9-foot pedestal on Grant Avenue in the park. It took 16 years from the time the idea of such a monument was conceived in 1988 to its completion and dedication in February of 2004. The cost of the monument was $300,000. The city of Vicksburg provided a seed or match investment. I was mayor at that time, but the city provided $25,000. And the remaining $275,000 was secured in 2001 under an African American Heritage Preservation Grant from the state of Mississippi, which had a bond program. The idea for the monument was approved by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History and was funded by the Mississippi Legislature through House Bill number 1682, which I think was approved in 2000. Now, while these are just a few pertinent things about the monument, I want to spend a little time sharing with you some things that led to the conception of the monument in the first place. In early March of 1988, I was approached by former Mississippi Governor William F. Winter, who happened to have been in Steele as a friend and a historian. And Governor Winter, who was serving as chairman of the program committee for a symposium on the 125th anniversary of the Vicksburg campaign of the Civil War,
that was scheduled for mid-May of that year in Vicksburg. The governor approached me about making a presentation. Now, at the time, I was a sitting elected member of the Warren County, Mississippi Board of Supervisors, and I had announced about a week earlier that I would be a candidate for the office of mayor of the city in April of 1988. I indicated to Governor Winter that I really didn't see where I would have the time to do a thoroughly researched scholarly paper, but he asked if I could make some comments because it was an oversight in the first place to not have any Blacks on that program. And I agreed to make some general comments at the symposium in Vicksburg, which is my hometown. I knew a few things about Black soldiers at Milliken's Bend, and I knew that their participation, their performance really had changed the dialogue regarding the suitability of ex-slaves for war. Also, although I knew some things about Bend and its overall significance, I immersed myself as much as I could in view of the schedule that I had in researching and reading on the topic over the next couple of months. I made my comment. It's located on the west side of the Mississippi River, about 15 miles northwest of Vicksburg. It is in Louisiana, and it was a place of little consequence prior to the Civil War. That sort of changed when Ulysses S. Grant, commander of Union forces, decided to locate his headquarters along with and supply depots at Milliken's Bend during the Vicksburg campaign. Now, once Grant relocated his headquarters away from that area, Milliken's Bend was an area where former slaves from plantations from river counties and parishes in Mississippi and Louisiana were assembled with an idea of them taking over abandoned plantations along the Mississippi River. However, when the Bureau of U.S. Colored Troops was established in May 1863, some regiments of the United States Colored Troops were raised former slaves. These ex-slaves, comprising an overwhelming majority of Union personnel at Milliken's Bend, were essentially relegated to guard and garrison duties with reference to the Union depots and hospitals that were left at Milliken's Bend. Now, the prevailing view that was held of ex-slaves by whites at this point in time was that they were without the discipline necessary for war. They believed that they could not follow strict military order, that they did not possess the valor required by war, and that they would not fight. Now, possibly seizing upon this set of beliefs and the access that Milliken's Bend would provide in helping their Confederate comrades at Vicksburg if they were successful, Confederate troops from Texas attacked the mostly Black Union troops at Milliken's Bend around 2:30 or 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning, June 7th, which was the 21st day of the 47-day siege of Vicksburg with battle cries of no quarters. Now, Milliken's Bend defense was essentially in the hands of these ex-slaves about whom the above opinions were held, who had been brought into the military service by the Union about 2 to 3 weeks earlier when the Bureau of U.S. Colored Troops was established. The weapons they had been issued were largely inferior weapons. Along with that, some of the ex-slaves had been issued weapons just the day before, and some did not even know how to operate the weapons. it was a devastating, bloody battle featuring the fiercest hand-to-hand combat that one can imagine. There were beatdowns with the butts of guns and the use of bayonets. And the battle lasted about 9 hours or until about noon that Sunday and ended with the involvement of 2 Union gunboats who entered the fray. Now, at the end of the fight in that day, records showed that Confederates suffered 44 fatalities, 31 wounded, and 10 missing. Soldiers experienced 101 fatalities, 285 wounded, and 266 that were captured or missing. Now, as can be discerned from these data, Black troops suffered astoundingly. 59%, or 652 of their 1,100 men were statistics of war, and about 13%, or 185 of the 1,500 Confederate soldiers were battle statistics. Also, an up-close view of the battlefield revealed that an untold number of fatally wounded Black soldiers lay dead. They had experienced immediate death with bullet holes in the top of their heads, execution style. Black Union soldiers had suffered tremendously during the encounter. The mostly Black Union troops at Middleton's Bend were the victors, ending the attempt by the Confederates to thwart the siege at Vicksburg and provide the Union with they provided the Union with a resounding victory in this battle. It also showed that poorly trained and ill-equipped ex-slaves in whom there were questions about their suitability for war had come through in a big way and had exhibited fearlessness, tenacity, determination, and valor. It was the first victory of a majority Black or ex-slave unit during the Civil War. Their efforts, valor, and success were lauded by National War officials, some top Union Confederate brass, and military men on the scene had lauded them for the fight they put up. And this contributed to the acceptability and utilization of Blacks in the war effort. In fact, the dialogue about the performance and suitability of Blacks had changed thanks to Black men at Milliken's Bend. Now, all of these things and more went into my presentation at the symposium. I also talked about the impact that the involvement and successes of Black men at Milliken's Bend had on their liberation and that of their people. W.B. Du Bois opined that Black men at Milliken's Bend earned and won their citizenship that day, and their efforts obviously were factors that contributed to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. My presentation at that symposium went a little bit better than I had thought. And over the months, I reflected on the civil rights implications of the successes of Black men at Milliken's Bend. The involvement of Blacks at Milliken's Bend was the continuation of a fight for equality that was the aim of Nat Turner, David Walker, and others that was evident during the antebellum period. And it was a forerunner, more or less, of the struggle that Blacks waged through the 1960s in working for the Voting Rights Act, and that struggle continues today. Now, for some reason, I cannot get Milliken's Bend and what it meant in a larger sense out of my mind. As a child, parents would take us to the National Military Park for picnics, to climb the observation towers that we call winding stairs, and to look at the monuments. And we never found anything about Black folk in the park, however, because nothing was in the park about Milliken's Bend. I concluded that there should be something there. So it dawned on me that there should be a monument about Milliken's Bend. To have such a monument became the cornerstone of my plans as mayor. I was able to help the city of Vicksburg for a cultural landscape project, and I got some support to allocate some funds for a smaller project on Milliken's Bend. However, I lost the election in 1993 and accepted a position in history at Tougaloo College. And while I was at Tougaloo, I found out that the new administration in Vicksburg had reallocated the funds for the project. And from that point, I worked to get myself reelected as mayor in 1997. And I continued learning about Milliken's Bend. And I did a whole lot of talking with some older people, some of whom had worked at the Vicksburg National Military Park. And I found that there had been a tablet about Milliken's Bend at the park. But that tablet had been melted down around 1941 to aid the World War II effort. It was never replaced. So between July of 1993, when I lost the election, and June of 1997, I worked in the City Hall in Vicksburg so that I could, among other things, finish the job on the monument. It was not easy, however. My staff and I did find a possible source of funding, but I had to go before the Board of Trustees of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History to get the request for the monument approved. Now, the board, that of a historical group that obviously has some historians on that board, questioned whether the USCT was involved at Vicksburg, and they rejected the request. And they sort of added injury to insult or insult to injury when they sent my request to a state university to evaluate my findings. Now, the response from that university's history department, I'm not going to call their name this morning, but they upheld the decision of the Board of Trustees. And I made a return visit before the board and laid out my findings when they got back with me. And they could not deny me at that time. I then appeared before the state legislative committee, and we were able to secure the funding we needed months before the election in 2001. Now, I did a couple of things that were sort of crucial at that time, because I had a feeling, because of some initiatives I had taken, that my reelection might be in jeopardy. And I decided to establish a commission on that Civil War monument. And there were some people included, a number of veterans, Black, whites, tourist people, and the like. And I made sure that I became the chairman of that commission. So we had the money and everything. I became the chairman, so no matter who got elected, we could have that monument done. When it was dedicated on February 14, 2004, there were approximately 2,000 people in attendance on a very rainy, cold day. And there were at least 50 people who were direct descendants of the USCT who fought at Milliken's Bend, who were in attendance. And one thing I'll mention in concluding is that it was really a great day. My family and I were walking into the park, slipping and everything on the wet ground. And a reporter approached me and she said, Mr. Walker, would you pray for this weather, this rain? And I turned to her and said, I prayed for this day. And to end, let me just say that one of the best things that has happened in Vicksburg and with the military park has been that monument. It has been something that has inspired a young person in the light. And I also gave to Mr. Tyndall painting by a local artist who did a drawing of Union soldiers. With that, just thank you everybody for having had this opportunity to be with you today.
Thank you, Mr. Walker, for that wonderful presentation. Mr. Bill?
Welcome back, and I'll turn the program back to Julian Tripp to introduce our next panelist.
Thank you, Bill. I have the pleasure of introducing Ms. Heather Wilson. She is currently the Deputy Director of the Cameron Art Museum in Wilmington. She holds a BA in English from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a Master of Fine Arts from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. She is a project director for the United States Color Droop's memorial sculpture by artist Stephen Hayes, a project involving the United States Living History Reenactment Group. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you, Tryon Palace and the 35th USCT, and especially thank you to Karen. I'm so happy to be here to talk about the USCT Public Sculpture Project at the Cameron Art Museum. And you might be asking, why is an art museum here to talk about the USCT? The Cameron Art Museum was built on sacred ground. The very soil where the museum stands was the site of the Battle of Forks Road, a Civil War skirmish whose victory was won by the USCT. The museum is in an interesting situation as an art museum. I don't think that there are any other art museums in probably the whole entire country that are also stewards of a historic Civil War site. And that has always been very important to us. And we have wanted to commemorate this site with a work of contemporary art for a long time. And so when we got the opportunity, we applied for an inclusive public art grant from the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, and we were thrilled to receive it. We're working with a Durham-based artist named Stephen Hayes, who will be installing a sculpture in November of 2021 at the CAM. The Battle of Forks Road, which took place on campus, is where 1,600 brave African-American soldiers from 5 different regiments fought for their freedom and the freedom of their families at the Fall of Wilmington. This story is vitally important to our community. So I'd like to introduce you to Stephen. This picture is Stephen Hayes. He's a Durham-born artist who now teaches at Duke University. He's known for his figurative work, specifically depicting the African-American experience. Stephen works with bodies. He depicts the African-American body, and his work is beautiful, it's thoughtful, it's meaningful, and it's deep. When we were looking for an artist, we reached out across the state of North Carolina. We talked with the North Carolina Arts Council and North Carolina curators and North Carolina museums, and the name on everyone's lips was Stephen Hayes. And then we saw his work, and we knew he was who we wanted to work with. Hayes is best known for his MFA thesis work from the Savannah College of Art and Design called Cash Crop. Cash Crop features 15 life-size statues chained to a pallet representing the 15 million people who were transported as slaves from Africa to America. His work has been featured at the National Cathedral, at Winston-Salem State University, at Duke, at Cam Raleigh, at the Rosa Parks Museum, at the African American Museum of Philadelphia, and the Harvey B. Gantt Center, among others. He is the recipient of the 2019 North Carolina Arts Council Emerging Artist Award, and he has attended residencies at the McCall Center and at the Halcyon Arts Lab in Washington, D.C. And this will give you a glimpse of Stephen's work. This is Cash Crop. His work is powerful, it's emotional, it's beautiful, it's haunting. Stephen is such an amazing artist, and we're thrilled to be able to work with him. This is a rendering that gives you an idea of what the statue will look like. The statue is life-size, it is bronze. It will actually be on the last vestige of Federal Point Road, which is where the 1,600 African-American soldiers marched in the Battle of Forks Road. The back 3 rows, there's 3 rows of 3 men that are in relief and 2 men coming forward, the drummer man and the color bearer. On the back, we are inscribing the names of the 1,600 men who served at the Battle of Forks Road. One of the things that Stephen brought to the project, one of the things that he brought that really deepened the project was that Stephen wanted to do life casts for this project. We know that many of the men who fought at the Battle of Forks Road and were victorious in the Fall of Wilmington stayed and settled in Wilmington. They became part of the fabric of our community and built a thriving merchant class. We also know that many of the USC descendants still live in Wilmington. So Stephen wanted to cast the features of USCT descendants, USCT reenactors, and other community members for this sculpture. We had an amazing day-long experience when Stephen was on his feet for 12 hours, working with these men, asking them to imagine that they were in the place of these USCT soldiers getting ready for battle at the Battle of Forks Road, and then he cast them. They had to sit with this material on their faces. Many of the 35th USCT did this, and you can see what it looked like. This is an image of Stephen working. He had never worked in front of people, but I think people were so captivated by the process that they wanted to stay and watch and share their stories and talk about the legacy of the USCT. Many of the men that were cast are veterans. We have Vietnam veterans who were cast as well. And then the features, the next step in the process was that Stephen used these molds to cast the faces. And you can see what they started to look like. This is early in the process. We're a little farther on in the process. This is Stephen with our director, Ann Brennan. And now this, those 3 rows of 3 men are at the foundry right now. The molds are being created, and they will be made into bronze. Stephen has just gotten back into his studio at Duke, and so he'll
We apologize for the technical difficulties, and now we'll return to our symposium. Heather?
Hi, so I'm back. I'm sorry about that. Just to finish up, at the Cameron Art Museum, we hope that the sculpture will spark dialogue and create community conversations. That's our intention, that create a fuller understanding of our common history and our shared humanity in Eastern North Carolina. We were motivated by a couple of reasons to tell this story. Wilmington itself lacks a powerful public artwork that tells the story of the USCT. In fact, the built environment of Wilmington, its parks, statues, monuments, plaques, and public art tell an overwhelmingly one-sided story of the Civil War, the story of white Confederate soldiers and leaders. While progress has been made in telling other stories through public art in the city through the 1898 monument, there are no monuments celebrating the African American struggle for freedom, and there are no figurative works of African Americans in our region at all. In the U.S., there's 1,503 public monuments commemorating the Confederacy. In North Carolina, there are 140 on public ground. There's only one memorial, non-figurative, commemorating the USCT in North Carolina. And the leadership of our project, which includes reenactors, community members, historians, descendants, and educators, believe that our built environment has the ability to spark conversations, influence change, connect people across lines of difference, and impact our individual and collective identity. You can get involved in this project if you like by visiting our website. You can learn more about what's coming up with the USCT Public Sculpture Project. Stephen and I are doing a virtual program for AARP in North Carolina in November that you're welcome to come and watch. The USCT Public Sculpture Project has been featured in the New York Times. It's also been featured internationally in a publication in Berlin. I'd like to close today with a quote from Stephen about the importance of this project. Stephen says, as a Black man in America, you see the imagery of a Black person in chains, being whipped, begging, kneeling, and helpless. This project is important to me because as a creator, I get to change that narrative by giving Black soldiers a sense of honor and pride. UNC TV is doing a documentary on this project, and we'll be thrilled to share that with you when it comes out. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for this opportunity. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Heather. We appreciate your time. Bill? Yes. I also have the pleasure of introducing attorney Bernard Seiler. Attorney Seiler is the author of Parallel Lives, A Tale of Two Centuries, and You Could Go to Jail. He is an author on the United States Color Troops and was an actor and advisor for the movie Glory. He has also published articles in the Washington Post and the Washington Times. He is an attorney and has been a prosecutor for the District of Columbia. Mr. Seiler, welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm gonna, like my comrade Bernard George, gonna see if this PowerPoint works. And I would just ask the moderator, do you see a PowerPoint there?
No, we do not.
Okay. Then we're gonna move on. Yes, I'm talking about pretty much a summary of some of the things that others have talked about. Bernard George and Dr. Meekins and others have talked about certain aspects of the United States colored troops during the Civil War. And the presentation I named Their Last Full Measure of Devotion. Now that's a take from President Lincoln's famous address at Gettysburg after the Battle of 1863, where he dedicated the National Cemetery and concluded that the men who had died the Union's position was that of not expanding slavery to the territories. But somehow or another, Black folk, Frederick Douglass included, and many of the other enslaved people on Southern plantations got the notion that there had to be something beneficial for them when a group of white men from the North were engaged in mortal combat with their masters. It didn't take a soothsayer to figure out that that can only spell good for those enslaved people. So from the very beginning, Black folk wanted to join the Union Army. A Jacob Dobson, who was a resident of Washington, D.C., had been a veteran of some of the Western wars with John C. Fremont out west, had personally delivered an invitation to the Secretary of War, Cameron, explaining the fact that he had several men right there in the District of Columbia who would be willing to join and fight for the Union, and at that point to save the country. The War Department, in no uncertain terms, gave a polite thank you, but no thank you. But that still didn't deter all of those men who were anxious to fight. Now, at the time of the war, when it first broke out, the North and South had opposite populations, you might say. The North had about 23 million people based on the 1860 census, and the South approximately 9 million, of which a large portion of those were enslaved people. So the North had a decided advantage when the war first began. It would soon play out that this increased manpower that the North had would serve to its advantage in several issues that came up during the course of the war. But let's go back. 1861 is when the war began, and all those Black men clamored to fight for the Union, and they wanted to join the Army. They had a history of military service, notwithstanding the 1793 Militia Act that prohibited the military service from employing anybody other than free white men. Notwithstanding that, Black men proved their valor in the War of 1812. a black sailor by the name of Cyrus Tiffany saved the life of Commodore Perry at the Battle of Lake Erie. But these things were forgotten. Crispus Attucks had died for the country, of course, not a military member, but Salem Poor and Peter Salem had done outstanding work at the Battle of Bunker Hill during the Revolution. This was all forgotten by the Civil War, as one of the earlier speakers alluded to. The prevailing belief in this country was one of extreme prejudice. It was thought that black men would not fight. There would be cartoons in northern newspapers, not just southern newspapers, northern newspapers that would show the stereotypical with the exaggerated African features of a slave in uniform running at the sound of the first cannon shot. Lincoln himself even quipped that I'm afraid that if we give 100 rifles to the black soldiers, that will be 100 rifles that will end up in the hands of the Confederates. So that was the prevailing view in this country. However, for whatever reason, the Secretary of Navy, Gideon Welles, had a different outlook for the Navy. Now, there have been several theories as to why the Navy early on, in September of 1861, determined that black men who wanted to serve aboard ship were welcome. There's several theories about that, one of which is that life aboard ship in the 19th century was so rigorous and difficult that nobody wanted to do it. So the Navy Department could ill afford to turn away anyone. The other reason is that the men on a battleship had to form a natural cohesive unit. They were all confined in one space and they depended on one another, and there literally was no room for prejudice in those types of settings. But nevertheless, the Navy Department was open to the use of black troops well before the Army. And they didn't have to wait long to see action, because one of the first battles of the Civil War and the first campaigns of the war, one of the speakers alluded to, is when General Butler led a flotilla down the Atlantic coast from Fort Monroe in Tidewater, Virginia, to enter into Hatteras Inlet on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. You have to go back and remember a little bit about the war plan and how the Lincoln administration had blockaded southern ports in order to cripple its economy and consequently weaken it with respect to its ability to prosecute the war. Well, the South found what was called a back door to the Confederacy. Those inlets right there on the Outer Banks of North Carolina between Hatteras Island and Ocracoke Island were ripe for blockade runners to slip through the harbor there and enter into Pamlico Sound and be able to access eastern North Carolina cities like New Bern, where Tryon Palace is, and the other towns on the east coast of North Carolina, ironically, where many of the United States colored troops were ultimately mustered from. In order to protect that entrance, two fortifications were built right off the coast of Hatteras Island in North Carolina. The fort was constructed by slaves and by some white Confederate soldiers. Forts Clark and Hatteras guarded the entry to Hatteras Inlet. So Butler's expedition was for the purpose of occupying those forts and therefore closing off that quote unquote back door to the Confederacy. So in August 28th, 1861, the flotilla headed down the coast with ships like the USS Wabash, the USS Minnesota, and the USS Cumberland. And after a tense bombardment, Forts Clark and Hatteras were finally subdued. But the important thing with respect to this lecture is the fact that those three warships were manned by a significant number of African-American crewmen. In fact, the USS Minnesota had 80% of its gun crew as African Americans. And I'm kind of sorry I don't have a couple of my PowerPoint slides, but they are photographs of various warships. And in a random selection of Union battleships of the crew, you will see frequently a large number of Black sailors. And that was pretty much a microcosm of the entire Union Navy. As it turns out, the Union Navy ended up being 1/4 African American, and that's approximately 30,000 sailors. And of those 30,000, 2,800 of those never made it home. But with respect to Forts Clark and Hatteras, they were subdued in large part to the Black crewmen aboard those 3 battleships in General Butler's flotilla. A few months later, the USS Monitor fought the Merrimack, and some of the archaeological findings in the records of the Monitor show that there had been Black crewmen aboard the Monitor, the one that was engaged with the famous battle against the Merrimack on March 9th, 1862. So the Navy was well entrenched with African-American soldiers, African-American sailors. And it's a mystery to some extent as to why such a disparity between the Navy and the Army. But finally, the Army did come around. My colleague Bernard George talked about how in the early part of the war, to quote him, the North was getting its butt kicked in most of the battles. They had lost decisively at Bull Run in the first summer of the war. They lost again at Bull Run in the second summer of the war. Against this backdrop, agitators like Frederick Douglass were constantly nudging the Lincoln administration to employ the use of Black soldiers. As the quote said, I'm paraphrasing, let the Black man get upon his breast a brass U.S. Eagle and bullets in his pocket, and it cannot be denied that he has earned his right to citizenship. Or perhaps the notion of Black men earning their right to citizenship explains some of the reluctance of the powers that be to allow African-American soldiers in in addition to all the stereotypes that the United States at that time had about Black Americans. But the fortunes of war changed that. With all of those battlefield losses and 2 other important factors. In the summer of 1861 and the summer of 1862, 2 pieces of congressional legislation came into play that would ultimately turn the tide as to what the War Department's attitude was about the employment of Black soldiers. And they were both called Confiscation Acts. And collectively, these 2 acts basically indicated that any slaves that the Confederacy was using in their war effort, for example, the fortifications at Fort Hatteras and Fort Clark, the use as slaves as they had been on the plantation there, they were essentially slaves of the Confederate Army. Once this was pointed out to the president and the Congress, these 2 acts then enable federal forces to seize slaves as part of a war confiscation. In other words, since the Confederates had based their whole concept on the fact that these people were property, then if they're using this property in a war effort, the reasoning would be that, well, just like a cannon, just like a horse, just like a wagon, just like a rifle, all of those things are being used against the United States in a full-fledged war. So if people are being used like property, then they should be confiscated too. Well, that's all Black folk needed to hear, because as soon as the rumor got out that Union lines were friendly to runaway slaves, And they weren't all friendly to him, but that was enough of an incentive for folk to leave the plantations in droves. In fact, down at Fort Monroe, if you go to Hampton, Virginia right now, Fort Monroe is now part of the National Park Service. When I was on active duty, it was actually an active duty installation. But right outside of the gate, when you are leaving downtown Hampton, there's a little community called Phoebus. And Phoebus was established because of the hordes of former slaves rushing to get into Fort Monroe based on this notion that the United States Army would confiscate them in order to deprive the Confederates of their use. A very interesting incident happened in May of 1861 right at Fort Monroe. One could argue that slavery, for the most part, ended right then and there on a May day in 1861. Now, General Butler, among other things, he seemed to be everywhere in the war. He had led that expedition down to Cape Hatteras. Prior to that, he was in command at Fort Monroe. And while he was in command, 3 slaves escaped from some of the plantations along the Southeast Virginia Tidewater area. And in rowboats, they got themselves to Fort Monroe. They went into the fort and asked for refuge. Now, the War Department had no official policy as to what to do with slaves yet. So they were kind of held there until further instructions could be given from the War Department. Well, while there, their master, a Mallory, he was a Confederate officer, came under a flag of truce to bring back his slaves and talk to the command at Fort Monroe without hostilities, but to just retrieve the property. Well, I love Ben Butler, number one, for his tenacity, the way he dominated New Orleans once New Orleans fell to the Union, but I also love him because, like me, he was a lawyer. And he used his lawyer skills in negotiating with Mr. Mallory. So Mallory comes to the fort and says, hey, I want my 3 slaves back under a flag of truce. Can I get them back? And you might recall, before the Civil War, about a decade before, there was something that the United States Congress passed called the Fugitive Slave Act. And that's the onerous act that said that any white person coming across a black person could claim that that was their slave, swear by affidavit in front of a federal judge that it was, and that slave would have no say and would have no option but to be brought back into slavery. That was still in effect when the Civil War came up. So when General Butler asked Mallory, what's the basis of your request for these slaves back? He said, oh, the Fugitive Slave Act. And General Butler seemed shocked. He said, well, the Fugitive Slave Act? Now keep in mind, this is May of 1861. And Butler says, well, why are you citing a United States statute? He says, because y'all said y'all are not part of the United States anymore. So just if you'd seen me yesterday, I could have helped you. But yesterday, y'all said y'all were part of a new country. So I'm sorry, the Fugitive Slave Act does not apply to a foreign country. What you say, now, do you want to come back in the Union? And we can talk. But if you don't want to come back in the Union, then the Fugitive Slave Act does not apply to a foreign country. So sorry, you can't have your slaves back. Well, somehow or another, black folk around there heard about that. So if you go to Fort Monroe right now, there's a big plaque in the middle of the base that says Freedom Fortress, because the word got out to all the slaves throughout southeastern Virginia that if you can get to Fort Monroe, you got it made. Freedom Fortress is what it became known. And that's what led to the 2 confiscation acts that now put the Confederacy in a position where if they use former slaves, or in their mind slaves, to help in the war effort, they risked losing them. Well, this led to other progress along with the bad fortune of war, to the point where one of the previous speakers talked about the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, all of these things led to it. And throw in also the constant fear that England or France may jump in and help the Confederacy. Now, mind you, England and France, particularly England, had every reason, if they were going to jump in on either side, it would be the Confederacy. And that's primarily because of the Southern Cotton. They had riots in Bristol and Liverpool where folk were out of work and folk were destitute and hungry because of the cotton that was no longer making it into the British ports, thanks to the Lincoln blockade around the southern United States ports. So there was every potential incentive for England to help the Confederacy, and through no small part on the Confederates' part of begging them to do so. But Lincoln then turned the war into a crusade against slavery. And he did so with the Emancipation Proclamation. And one would have to think that part of his thinking was a deterrent to keep England and France from helping the Confederacy. Now, mind you, there's evidence that Lincoln was also a compassionate human being. Maybe there was some of that in there too. But one thing he did know, well, he knew two things. England and France would not jump in on the side of a country that had declared itself a slave republic. Remember when Jefferson Davis and Alexander H. Stephens took their respective oaths of office for president and vice president of the Confederacy down in Montgomery, Stephens said, "This country is founded on the great truth of the superiority of the white race over the black race." So the country was founded on white supremacy. Problem is, about 30 years before the war, a member of parliament in England by the name of William Wilberforce, sound familiar, all you HBCU graduates? Wilberforce pushed through legislation in parliament that outlawed slavery in the entire British Empire. So by the time of the Civil War, Britain had no more use of slavery and no more use of a slave republic. And at that point, they were not going to help the Confederacy for that reason alone. In addition, as was mentioned previously, the Union had not been faring very well in battle. So Lincoln literally tabled the Emancipation Proclamation until they could get a Union victory. And that victory came on September 17th, 1862, at a small creek near Hagerstown, Maryland, called Antietam. And as Mr. George pointed out, was the bloodiest day in American history. It was narrowly a Union victory. If you want to call losing 13,000 men on your enemy side and you losing 12,000 a victory, well, for purposes of the emancipation, that was enough, coupled with the fact that Lee retreated back over the Potomac. That was the victory that Lincoln needed. And then, of course, then it was issued, became effective January 1st, 1863. And among all the other benefits and clauses within the Emancipation Proclamation was the authorization of the United States military forces to use African-American troops to man fortifications and to man vessels, as Lincoln indicated. So now, the proof had to be in the pudding. Black men were finally allowed officially to fight in the Civil War. So several regiments formed. Some regiments had formed before the emancipation, quite without the authority of the War Department. But in the spring of 1863, the winter and spring of 1863, regiments came into being, and the 54th Massachusetts of glory fame is one of those that began their training outside of Boston in the spring of 1863. If you can see over my shoulder a little bit, you can see members of the 54th lined up in front of their Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. Now, once again, black men had something to prove. Number one, they had something to prove to themselves that they were men. Number two, they were fighting to, in their mind, free their brethren in bondage. They didn't care what the War Department said. All they knew was that there could be no victory for their brethren to escape bondage if they didn't win the war. You know, they didn't know whether the war was necessarily dedicated to their liberty, but they knew that if they lost, nothing good could come of that. But proof was in the pudding. The very first battle of the war in which black troops fought of any significance was about 10 days before that great presentation that the mayor gave about Milliken's Bend on May 27th, 1863 at Port Hudson, Louisiana, a battlefield right outside of Baton Rouge. And Dr. Smith and I had the pleasure of going.
Mr. Seiler?
Yes.
We're going considerably over time and would ask you if you could wrap up your presentation in a few minutes.
Will do. So the Battle of Port Hudson took place May 27th, 1863. Black men from 3 Louisiana regiments stormed a stronghold by the Confederates. Out of 900 men that charged the fort, 600 were killed, wounded, or captured. I'm going to summarize near the end here about one of the interesting plights of black soldiers. I'll skip ahead a little bit and say that in the end, President Lincoln said that the war could not have been won without the contribution of black troops. But I want to talk to you about an area of black participation in the Union Army that ties in with my love of the law as well as love of history. Davis and the Confederates indicated that there would be no quarter given. And one of the speakers talked about how the proclamation was that any black men captured on the battlefield would be executed or returned to slavery. Okay, that violated what was then the Articles of War. But as a result of that policy, which Lincoln was able to effectively refute by issuing certain aspects of retaliation, it just so happened that Lincoln asked a professor from Princeton, Dr. Lieber, who had been a veteran of the Prussian Wars in Europe, to come up with a code called Lieber's Code. And this talked about the legal conduct of war and how war had to be made humane. One of the principal features of that code was that enemy combatants who are captured should not be discriminated or treated differently because of their ethnicity, their race, their religion, or any other reason like that. It just so happened in 1863, when Dr. Lieber presented this code to Lincoln, that the first European representatives happened to be meeting the following summer in Geneva to come up with a humane way to fight war. So the very first Geneva Convention was in August of 1864, and smack right dab in the middle of those concepts that those first diplomats came up with was a criteria that enemy combatants shall not be treated harshly, discriminated against, killed, or in other way harmed because of their ethnicity. And that trickled all the way down through the Hague Convention of 1907 and the Geneva Conventions of 1949, and is now codified in Army Field Manual 2710, which basically says that there should not be any mistreatment of foreign or enemy combatants when captured because of their race. So if anything came out of the Civil War that I like to take away from that, is that our modern day law of war derived basically from the way that Confederate troops treated Union troops. There were atrocities like Fort Pillow and Poison Springs, where Black troops were massacred, but Black troops didn't take it lying down, because right after Poison Springs, in April of 1864, Confederates were captured at a battle called Jenkins Ferry on the Sabine River in Texas. And when they stormed the Confederate fortification, they came in saying, "No quarter, remember Poison Springs, remember Fort Pillow." And they sent one Confederate soldier back who wasn't massacred, quote unquote, by mistake. And he took with him a warning to the other Confederates that if you come in here, we're not taking any quarter either. There's a lot more I can say, and this subject is a very exhausting one, and we could talk about it all day. And I too join in with my tribute and thanks to Sharon Bryant, who has been relentless in her dedication to presenting this story at Tryon Palace. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie, for that very informative session. We appreciate all of the speakers in this session. And back to Bill.
I want to thank all of you for listening in today, and I apologize for the 2 interruptions. We lost internet service a couple of times. I become even more appreciative of the work that teachers are doing remotely. If you are interested in learning more about Tryon Palace, please visit us at www.tryonpalace.org.
And I'm a reenactor with Tryon Palace's 35th United States Colored Troop Regiment. The last time we met,
Okay.
I and fellow reenactor William Holland.
We told them, Sharon told them, everybody.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks.
Were formed here under the leadership of Colonel James C. Beecher, who was an abolitionist from the North. The reenactors are here to recreate elements of common camp life that the 35th Troops experienced during the American Civil War. Soldiers would march, sometimes up to 25 miles a day, then set up camp, and would often wait days or weeks before actually engaging in the battle. Organized camp life was critical to keeping the unit well-oiled for battle. Communication with loved ones back home was absolutely critical to the morale of the unit. So these soldiers who could write letters, those who could write, did so during their downtime in camp life. Reenactors will read some of the passionate letters of their experiences in the field, because their wives back home wanted to know what they were going through. The 35th reenactors and I invite you to enjoy our recreation of camp life in a Union Army camp, with the added flavor of how African Americans seeking freedom put their spin on how they endured camp life. Enjoy.